Right, so we'll take it from here. So hello everyone, welcome. I'm joined again by Eros. How are you doing, Eros?
I'm hanging in there, man. Hanging in there. A little smoky up here with all these fires, but we're making it through.
Yeah. So you were discussing there regarding the sun as the primary sort of archontic driver. You were also discussing that comet, pardon, as well, whose corona exploded and it's now larger than Jupiter. You were developing, pardon, a point there just prior to me beginning this recording. Do you want to take it from there, man?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think we were starting off about how we've been yesterday, today. We've both been feeling a little off, almost like dizzy spells and what have you. And a lot of it is like directly environmental. Smoke, what you ate yesterday, how your sleep has been. That's all very immediate. But then there's essentially, in my view, nested layers of influence, and this is because really bringing in a lot of like Whitehead's philosophy, of like relation, which is part of a whole network of philosophers. It's not just Whitehead, but I think Whitehead is sort of the primary guy.
No,
But
no pun
Nietzsche's in there.
intended.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so that just means that not everything isn't one in sort of like the Buddhist sense, in some kind of ontological sense of that, or Parmenidean sense of like, well, we are all just one thing, and division's illusory. Illusory. That's not my position. My position is that everything is connected, so everything has an influence upon everything else, and everything in these relational influences are like nested, like Russian dolls. And so, what you ate last night and what the air quality is can definitely have a direct effect on you. But that's nested within the environment in which you're in, whatever particular part of the earth you're in, and then the earth itself. And then that earth is nested in an environment of, this celestial environment. So the sun acts as sort of like the primary archon or warden of the planet. And like we've discussed many times, I think before, everyone views the sun as like, oh, it gives life, but its primary purpose is to harass the earth and to um, instigate change in the earth with that relation. And this is done primarily through electromagnetic plasma means of direct communication with the earth through things like Birkeland currents, which are these massive plasma sheaths that sort of reach out like tentacles to the northern pole of our planet. And then it's this toroidal communication and relationship through the North Pole out through the South Pole in relationship with our star, which is the sun. And so, what different bodies within the solar system are doing, their positions, their alignments, because they are all tethered in relation to the sun and the planet through these tentacles, if you will, of electromagnetic connection. Their relation, their geometry, uh, how much output they are putting out themselves in terms of this plasma electromagnetic relationship through this nested hierarchy gets all the way down to us. And you may have a dizzy spell, you may feel more agitated, you may feel more energized based on all these things. So yeah, I guess there's this comet that recently entered our solar system, and I think it's within the orbit of Jupiter now. And for whatever reason, its plasma sheath, its corona, basically its plasma corona, just absolutely exploded, and it's now, they say, larger than the size of Jupiter. So that can absolutely have an effect on our sun, and then which directly has an effect on us. I like to think of the sun as sort of like almost like an electrical relay station, where depending on, again, influences both within and without of the solar system, it's basically like a station that amplifies these communications and then delivers them to Earth. And this obviously works primarily on the 11-year sunspot cycle, which governs basically disease, but also the psychological states of mankind, as well as all of the different states, like the instinctual states and habitual states of animals on the planet, by affecting our magnetosphere. So it affects the magnetosphere. All of a sudden, let's say animals that use the magnetosphere for travel, birds, and water-dwelling animals, whales, and all these things. They can't find their way. They become lost. They become confused. The whales beach up on shore. The birds fall out of the sky. They end up in the wrong place for migration. We start seeing all of these weather anomalies and anomalies with the animals because the communication being received by the sun is changing. And things like comets sort of being like an X factor entering into the solar system can sort of change that whole communication process and then directly affect us on Earth. And, we're all subject to this. And I think, just to round this off, because I'll just keep rambling, I think the powers that be, one of their primary methods for analysis and decision making is tracking all of these movements as best they can, because what this allows for is for them to ride sort of these cyclical waves of input, output, increase, decrease of essentially power, especially in a psychological state. And this is all governed essentially by Apollo or the sun, right? So, yeah, maybe the dizzy spells we've been having is related to that. Who knows?
What's interesting as well, when I looked, this was several years back now, pardon. Um, I believe it was the Trojans. Oh God, what were they called? The Luwians, I think, was the native term for them. And they had a sort of it was a deity that was, I think it was almost syncretized with Apollo, and I forget its name now within the Luwian language, or the Hellenization of that name. But it roughly translates to either the mouse Apollo or the little Apollo. And ultimately, what I found interesting is you can actually trace this back to Reshef. And funnily enough, it also connects through Reshef to Yahweh, but they were all linked with the radiance of the sun. And furthermore, that of war. And then lastly, that of either the spear, the bow, but that was always a sort of symbol, both of conquest and war, yes, but of that of plague, of pestilence. So I always found that interesting, and that's an interesting connection you've brought up there. Um, so there was something else I was going to mention on that, which is I've been recently rereading The New Atlantis, The City of the Sun by Tommaso Campanella, Thomas More's Utopia, um, a couple of Philip K. Dick's works as well, exegeses, what's that one? Tractates, Crypticus, Scriptura, and there's a couple of other ones. And he talks about the Black Iron Prison. Now, interestingly, when you look into the New Atlantis, Thomas More's Utopia, God, even Plato's The Republic, Callipolis, though it doesn't really go into as much detail in terms of technology, and the full spectrum technocratic dominance of the climate, the entire environment essentially. But what you find in the New Atlantis is it goes into this sort of technocratic control grid. Philip K. Dick would then later go on to sort of describe this as the Black Iron Prison, right? And he didn't just discuss that in terms of the technocratic utopia that was envisioned by, if you will, the elite or the selected company of harbingers of this demiurgos or what have you, but of the sort of of the world in which we inhabit ourselves right now. So he stated this quote: "The empire is the institution, the codification of derangement. It is insane and imposes its insanity on us by violence, since its nature is a violent one. To fight the empire is to be infected by its derangement. Interestingly, this is a paradox. Whoever defeats a segment of the empire becomes the empire. Its proliferation like a virus, or pardon me, it proliferates like a virus. The Black Iron Prison was our world." And what's interesting is you see with the first horseman, who's almost a kind of Reshef, this sort of pestilential sun deity character in a way, is that he has a bow, but he has no arrows. So, what is I forget the Greek now, but it basically translates as He's not named, but he's described as he who conquers and is conquering, or something along those lines. This is Revelation 6:2. So what it implies, because he has no arrows, is he's almost induced this conquest, or perhaps pestilence, through a kind of subterfuge, a deception. And what's interesting as well is the entire horseman cycle begins with conquest, right? Or of course pestilence. So it's almost like conquest is being I mean it's firstly being related, well, even rebellion, it's being related to that of pestilence, and not just in the accoutrements like the bow and the spear, which relates back to Canaanite or other Levantine, and of course Anatolian pestilential deities, Mesopotamian pestilential and war deities, and of course, as you stated, solar deities. But it's also being related, this idea of conquest, to that of a pestilence, to that of a plague. I found that interesting, and then he goes on to state the Black Iron Prison was our world. Um, and he states that, oh, I don't want to get to that quote. That'll take us into a totally different tangent. But there was another one I had with the New Atlantis, and for the love of me now, I can't find it. But basically, it discusses this this new utopia, or this novel utopia on the horizon at the end of the sort of terminus of their agenda. And it discusses that the elite or philosopher kings of this utopia actually, firstly, they live on the sort of hinterland of human civilization as we know it now, but they want to sort of eventually conquer the world, right? To sort of assimilate by osmosis, not by conquest, but by osmosis, through subversion, all of mankind unto them. And they are manipulating mankind, the history of mankind, not just through subversion, not just through their harbingers, but also through weather manipulation. And it goes into a whole list of other technologies that you're sort of left scratching your head in total bewilderment, because this was, well, it was written, pardon me, it was written sometime around the 1622, 1623. It was posthumously published. Supposedly, Francis Bacon died. Some, of course, speculate that he did not, but it was officially posthumously published in 1627. So, how the hell could he fathom these types of technologies, even in a sort of primitive description of them? And it makes one wonder, firstly, are we dealing with a preter-human aspect to this? And are we dealing with something that is, it's almost beyond the demarcations of time as our mind can conjure them? That it perhaps exists in both the past, the present, future simultaneously. It's something perhaps not necessarily biological, right? Or of course, are we dealing with cycles within cycles, like what you're saying? This sort of this chain of being that is interrelational all the way back to the immemorialia of time. And I wonder, what's your take upon it? What's going on here? How can they fathom these technologies, in the 17th century, of weather modification, all of these full spectrum dominance tech?
Yeah. Yeah, well, from my personal perspective, I think that there is extra human communication going on. I think that this information is it likely. I think individuals, let's say like Tesla, can get like literal blueprints given to them in terms of the production of technology, or sort of like the seed technology, or even understanding, like the mathematical formulas or what have you, that act as the basis to accelerate technological production. which then allows for these technologies to be made, like these extreme technologies like weather modification. And some of the communication tends to be a bit more obscure, or the communication is done through um, like a mythopoetic route, whether that's like Tolkien or Lovecraft or some other route where it's given in almost like a mathematical function. It's called a functor, if I remember correctly, and it's just basically it translates literal historical events, and through the process of like an algebraic functor, it it acts as a function to translate historical events through a mythopoetic lens to make it more um, to have more of an effect in the actual world. And by that I mean is that it layers over real information with like a fictional layer, or even like a fictional coding, if you will. And that process of translating um, real being, real events, or real information, and it's almost like if you can code it in a fictional dress, it's easier for humans to take that information and process it through a will to power through the means of that coding, which is like story, like narrative. Because we are primarily, narrative driven beings, if we are given key information or vectors of will, right? Like assisting in bringing about the apocalypse, or the production of weather weapons for military advantage. If that's like the main seed form, but we're given it a narrative such as, um, well, this is the information given by fallen angels so that we may assist in making war against Yahweh. If it's coded in a certain narrative, it inspires mankind to pursue that narrative, go down that vector, take that route of the development of what's really going to make an actual change in the world, which is going to be the technology, right? The will to power through techne to cause direct, and like immediate actual change in the world. And so it doesn't have to, it depends on who the recipient is, but most of the time it does take a mythopoeic lens, because that tends to inspire mankind the most. So if you have 17th century 18th century individuals talking about this sort of much more um, advanced technology, or even events in the future, this is all being laced in like a hyperstitional way to bring about that future, to bring about that technology for a specific purpose. Now, this purpose is, as we mentioned in a previous discussion, tends to be like a hyper object or a hyper vector. And as humans, for the most part, we can only see like the immediate vectors ahead, the road ahead. And it's very difficult for us to see many twists and turns down the line where the ultimate objective is heading to, that massive gear that's moving. And because we live in a dynamic world and we have these constant pressures of like, hunger and libido and sex and fear and anxiety, these things keep us very locked into the present moment, keep us very focused on the couple turns that we can see ahead. And we're not able to see far down the path. But if there are entities, beings, consciousness that can have a higher multi-dimensional view of the path ahead, we can be seeded with information primarily through mythopoeic means that can guide us on these more long-term vectors that we just can't immediately see. So we're kind of led about by the nose a lot of the time. And I think this process not only generates history, not only puts us on a linear, let's say even apocalyptic or path of concrescence, to bring in Whitehead again, leading up to sort of like this omega point. But what it also acts as, in my opinion, is a sort of a test to see which individuals or even groups of individuals will be led about by the nose, or which individuals as well um, can sort of be separate, in at least in their perception, from that process, and understand that they are being led about by the nose, and thereby grant a higher perspective, a verticality of perspective, to see farther and see where these multiple turns and winds in the road is ultimately leading to. So in that process, as well as with, it seems, all processes, it is a process of selection, through trial, right? Through pain, through testing, there's a process of selection that's going on. Ipso facto, by the fact that we have constant dynamic change and we have the selection of vectors or paths into a future which we ultimately can't see to its fullest extent, but there's varying degrees of being able to see, into the future, so to speak, which is, again, a process of selection, it would seem.
Yeah, so you would that be the sort of teleology of the system that we see right now from in terms of life itself and it's the mechanics of life that we see, the nature of life? Would you see the teleology as a sort of process of larger selection? And then of course as well that begs the question. Um, Ultimately we're selecting, for this sort of hyper predator. There's something I came across recently, work by John Keel, and he calls it the super spectrum. And the way he describes it is very, very similar. He
Yeah,
obviously doesn't
that's from
describe
his
it.
book, the Eighth Tower.
The Eighth Tower, yes, that's the one.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. The paraphysical super spectrum. And yeah, so it does appear man is sort of pushing towards the other. Now there was a philosopher I came sort of I guess I didn't actually touch upon his work. I sort of I confronted his work. It was quite challenging stuff, very depressing. What's his name? Philip Mainlander, and he has this notion that it's very nihilistic, but I think there's a sort of kernel of truth to it. And he states that effectively God is dead, right? And the sacrifice, this, let's just call it the self-sacrifice. He uses a different word, but this wouldn't fly on YouTube. The self-sacrifice of God leads towards life, right? That life is almost like the death throes, the fractal, fragmentary death throes of that extinguishing or that self-extinguishing of God. And thus, God can never be truly known. This explains the sort of Gnostic idea of the agnostos theos, the unknown God, the monads, the alien God, if you will. And moreover, as well, he states that um, this God that we simply just know as a force now, as Kabbalah states in the mystery state, that God isn't an entity, he is a force. Um, that was the way he describes it. Yes, that effectively everything that we see in life is moving towards an other. It's moving towards non-being. It wants to, this God force is pushing us towards non-being. This would also explain death, right? Um, Now, what's interesting about this is that when you look at what we've been discussing with, for example, the hyper-predator, what we were discussing there of the super spectrum, even the hyper-object, you name it, basically the black sun idea, and what we see the accelerationists do, ultimately, whether they know it or not, I think that they believe that they're trying to insulate themselves from this drive of the universe towards this non-being, non-beingness, right? That there's a selection process going on. But I think the deeper undercurrent is what they're in fact doing will lead to, yes, a hyper predator, but eventually it will lead to the sort of like the reign of terror, a grand self-devourment, so that the predator will predate upon itself once, of course, all prey has been extinguished. So eventually it leads towards, it's a sort of inevitability, that of non-being. And this explains as well what we've been discussing with contraction and expansion. And of course, this is seen within the mysteries and Kabbalah and the idea of creation ex nihilo, which is that the way creation ex nihilo occurs, it's not necessarily of ex nihilo, it's that everything drifts, contracts back in, collapses into nothingness. Once, of course, it has extinguished itself from that previous contraction, that initialization, the prima causa, the prime mover. That was this sort of self-sacrifice of the previous epoch or cycle, and then of course it expands once more into so it's similar to a sine wave, if you will, right? Ultimately, if we were to look at this on an even grander teleological scale, perhaps there is a selection process going on. It does, and this brings us to what we were discussing with pity, right? Why do we have pity? Now, of course, we can explain it with, well, perhaps it's to have that neutral or negative charge that is required within this sort of toroidal vector, toroidal engine. But then one must ask, but why? You know, why? If everything is selecting towards predation, why would it then require the opposite, or perhaps the neutral, adjacent, to thus select for this force? And it's very peculiar, you know, when you look at the metaphysics of it in that sense. I mean, if it was merely seeking selection, um, it was the way he described this with Mainlander's theory. If it was seeking selection, why did it self-extinguish? You know, if it was seeking selection, why would it drift towards non-being? Why would it drift towards hyper-predation? Why wouldn't it drift towards equanimity? And these are the sort of, I don't know if I've made sense there, but these are the sort of questions that I've got rattling about in my mind right now. I don't know if you have any comment to make upon that, and I'll go into other quotes that back up what you just stated there as well. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, no, because I've been rolling this around in my head too a lot, as we kind of discussed in private the other day. Really, just chewing on this, or in the biblical tradition we call it chewing the cud. And that's, where the cow chews the grass, swallows it, vomits it back up, chews it, swallows it, which is a metaphor I'm about to get here to in a second. Yeah, Mainlander's real dark stuff, sort of like bottom of the, or top, depending on your perspective, of that philosophical speculations. But if we take Mainlander, and let's take this sort of like contraction and expansion view of things, and I'm going to throw a pretty heavy metaphor on it, but maybe this will at least throw some things in the pile here that we can sort of chew on a little bit more. If we see that the entire driver process of the universe, as it is based upon the Heraclitean flux, so we're assuming the Heraclitean flux is a faithful representation of reality. So what that means is that you have this constant tension between differentiating aspects of things, and that tension between things is an asymmetry. So because it's not perfectly balanced, as we've discussed before, even to the smallest degree, there's some amount of asymmetry. This is what allows for movement and change in the universe and the cosmos. This process, because there is a general disposition of entropy, this process eventually gets to the point of states of devourment. Even if you have things that would seem to be less conscious or unconscious, let's say two plasma bursts or exchanges from between two stars, and they collide with each other. Whichever one, let's say, has more density, more energy, will overpower the other one and inculcate it into itself. Or let's say these astronomers will they run these models like if two galaxies were to collide, they would eventually one would almost devour the other, right? And you can see this in things like black holes or what have you, where as long as there's asymmetry, once you put them in relation to each other with some sort of kinetic energy, they one will essentially inculcate the other. It's not ever, we rarely ever see like a point of equilibrium that's like established and it never changes. So coming off of these basic principles, this is what is sort of setting up the physical cosmological environment of predation. So it would seem then that the entire cosmos is moving in this general disposition of predation. And then what happens is that a hyperpredator is produced. That hyperpredator comes into contact with other predatory beings. They're consumed. And as this process continues, you can sort of speculate and get to this point where within the cosmological extension of everything sort of that is, however big or small we speculate that to be, you eventually get to this point where like maximum devourment has taken place and there's sort of no other that is left to devour. And so as you mentioned, right, then you would have this almost self-devourment. And using a metaphor, it's almost as if this cosmological beast of predation is produced. And when there's nothing left to consume, it begins to consume itself. And what if this creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing, is really the process of essentially a self-devourment?
Mm-hmm.
And then that self-devourment produces a regurgitation in a metaphorical sense. And so it's the entire structured cosmos as it is structured, terraformed by competing species or entities, producing an ultimate hyperpredator, which devours all other lesser or weaker, less evolved entities it comes into contact with. And at the consumption and peak or concrescence of essentially predation, a sort of self-annihilation or devourment then takes place. And then at the other end of
Yeah.
that, sort of this big bang is a vomiting out, which is, if we look at vomit itself, it is the ultimate negretto, where you
Mm-hmm.
take structured information, structured energy in the form of food, and you devour it, and it goes through this process of dissolution and turns into a soup or a
Well,
liquid, if you will. Hmm.
just to interject really quickly, that would also explain why within the random architecture of what it appears random to us, it's merely just a higher form of order, but what appears random to us is that vomit, that soup. But ultimately there's enough sort of order within that that we can glean, I guess, up, if we scratch the surface mathematically of it, or even philosophically or cognitively, that the reason that there's enough order, that's visible to us within that, if you will, cosmic vomit of the physical laws and what have you, is because ultimately, like what you're saying, this is simply like a form of Negredo. It's taken the information and it's simply regurgitated it in a very sort of arbitrary or randomized manner. So there is order there. It's just sort of it's in a completely discombobulated state.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's sort of what, scientists would speculate as, you know, um, immediately after the Big Bang, um, then you get this sort of recombinatory process of interactions and stuff that is moving toward the production of the ego, that is moves towards the production of solidified, to use the metaphor, right? Like a solidified, individuated objects. This planet over here, this rock over here, as it is separate from everything else. And this sort of ties right into that sort of Kabbalistic view as well, where you have um, um, the shells, right? The clippa, because what a shell is a shell or a clippa. um, by the very use of that term shell is it's a sectioning off of a particular set of information or material, whatever it is, but it's separate from everything else. And because it has a shell, because it's encased, let's say, in a sphere, like a bubble, it is allowed to individuate from other things. And once it individuates, it can relate. So there can be no relation without individuation. And again, this is why certain like Neoplatonic views or Buddhist views are attempting to sort of return to this state of like almost like pure vomit, where nothing is individuated and everything is like coagulated into a soup, because they're looking to extinguish the ego, and the extinguishment of the ego unites you with everything, but only because it's a stage of negretto, but they never emerge from the negretto, or they never seek to emerge from the negretto. So this is Mainlander, right? And his certain views on extinguishment, to use the term, right? Where you're looking to essentially snuff out that clippa, right? But without the clippa, without the shells to individuate, you cannot relate. The thing is, though, is that relation, due to asymmetry and entropy, ends up being one of predation primarily. So then, using this metaphor, though, I was kind of thinking, like, well, just based on our physiology, our biology, what causes the vomit? Why isn't everything just simply consumed and then that's it? Well, vomit is usually caused by like an agitation or the swallowing of something, let's say bitter. So then what would be bitter to pure predation? Well, its opposing force, which would be pity. So would it then be that acts of pity or mercy, because they flow against the general tide of predation, which is nature? So nature, right? If we're going to become naturalists, if we're going to unite with Mother Gaia, and a lot of that New Age talk would be to seek the path of pure predation, because that's what nature is in all of its aspects. But what humans are able to do through Geist, through the our abilities to abstract, is because we have these high abilities of abstraction that directly causes high amounts of individuation. This is why, like in the tree of life, right, in the Kabbalistic system, to get to the tree of death, quote unquote, right, to get to the opposing tree, you go through that, right? You have to go through that window of knowledge, through Geist, through information. That is the process by which you get to the Klippa, the process that's like hyper individuation. And so that individuation through the process of abstraction allows you to relate. And then in that process of relation, as you relate to an other, due to our highly abstract sense, we have the ability to press the pause button on devourment. I don't just see you like a crocodile or a snake and immediately just devour you because you're like moving in front of me, and maybe you're just physically smaller than me, so I think I can take you on and I eat you. We have the ability to pause and say, will I or will I not devour? Will I or will I not kill or slay this man, right? And because we have the ability to interrupt that devourment process and take pity on one who we would have the power or dominance or will to power over to devour, that is sort of like a glitch in the system. It's sort of like a glitch. It's that bitter herb, it's that bitter poison or pill in nature. And is this, metaphorically speaking, what causes the regurgitation after that ultimate triumph of devourment? Because everything is not actually pure predation due to humans' ability to show pity, all of that information, those acts of pity, sort of are part of what is devoured. See, so it's like taking that a pill and putting it like in like a piece of meat for the dog to eat, and the dog's just going to devour up that meat. But in that meat is hidden that little pill of pity, and that causes the bitterness, and that causes the regurgitation, to so to speak, of of all things, right? Because it's not, it's I guess to go back to the Matrix, right? It's that oh, what do they call it? The anomaly.
The remainder of
Yeah,
a sum of an imbalanced equation.
an imbalanced equation, because it imbalances the system, because the system exponentially increases the ability to and the actual acts of predation. And we can see that now in our current aeon, right, with capitalism, whatever. The acts of predation increase and the ability for acts of predation increase, right? As we go through time, it is an exponential increase. But the anomaly in the system, the remainder, is these acts of pity, or sort of like mercy, that can be inserted into the code, if you will, and that all that information is devoured by this all-consuming force, it's going to consume that as well, and that's what sort of trips the wire at that ultimate concrescence and causes the rebirth of, whether it's like the aeon in a microcosmic scale, or we would even maybe say the cosmos at large in a macrocosmic scale. This is just something I've been literally bouncing around in my head the last like week or so.
Yeah, I think you're correct. I think I wrote something similarly to I put it in a different format, but that's an amazing analogy regarding the vomit notion, which is this. I was coming to the idea as well, you know, with the sort of maximal, and even in the chain of being. I mean, if you look at the idea that new universes are born from this basically maximalist or maximization of devourment through this hyper predator, and eventually the only way you wouldn't get to non-being or nothingness, if you will, is if, of course, like what you're saying, it reached that point of equation or equalization with, you know, the either a neutral a neutral adjacent, or an antagonistic agitator. So, you know, of course, what is what is the opposite of predation? Well, it's not necessarily prey in that sense. It is it's pity, right? Or it's to uh, it's that thing which puts a sort of spanner in the works of the motion of predation. And you see, funnily enough, you actually see this microcosmically. So with civilizations typically collapse because there's a multiplicity of factors. Neuroses is one. Now, where does the neuroses stem from, right? And this sort of cognitive exhaustion, it stems from ultimately a state which is in imbalance, right? Because there's a part of us that can't necessarily exist anymore within the hyper sanitized or clinical theatre, or on the stage of this theatre production. And eventually people begin to sort of, you know, become non-cohesive with the society. Entropy kicks in, and thus that social organism breaks down, similar to a biological organism as well. So what occurs with that? Decomposition. And you get the vultures, the carrions. They feast upon, you know, the corpse of the old, right? Or the corpse of the old becomes so bloated it explodes, right? It expands forth through this agitation, this swelling of gases and what have you. Not meaning to be morbid, but just to sort of use an analogy here. And then that spits forth its you know, decomposed nourishment to the earth itself, right? And then life begins yet again. Ex morte vitae, right? From life comes death, or life is excreto. Again, we're back to Bataille, we're back to even Land's work in Thirst for Annihilation, and several others.
Mm-hmm.
Even the Schopenhauerian will, though he doesn't explicitly state this, Philip Mainlander actually took inspiration from Arthur Schopenhauer's ideas of the will, but it's the same sort of notion, where it's almost like predation. Um, predation is the light in many in a sense of, you know, of the word. It's not just the pity. it's almost like a sort of black sun when you think of it like the black sun is made up of a duality that exists within, paradoxically, as a sort of simultaneity, um it exists within a state of hyper-predation and, if you will, hyper-pity at the same time, right? Within dark and light. It shouldn't exist, but yet it does. It's similar to life, right? Life is the equation of the immovable object meeting the unstoppable force, and so on and so forth, vice versa. Um, it's that idea that you have this all devouring, opaque, uh, jet black, fathomless black, nothingness, where all things stream into it. It devours all things, but it doesn't necessarily radiate them out. But there's something beyond it that it wears, if you will, upon its head, like the corona that surrounds it, that radiates out this this sort of vital essence. And so you have this recycling, just consistently. Now, in a similar manner, right, if we look at a chain of being, a sort of the matryoshka doll chain of this all, what is the grander teleology of this, right? As we see the hyper predator being devouring itself eventually, once that maximal threshold has been parsed or reached. And then from there, of course, the contraction occurs. That makes space for further expansion. We've just, it's the same idea as the magnum opus. But is this leading towards, like the world ages themselves lead towards this hyper predator? Is this leading towards something else, right? Perhaps not a hyper predator, perhaps something else, which thus generates a sort of incomprehensible relation or motion or network. And then beyond that, there's something else. So really what you get down to is ultimately, in the macrocosm, uh, to the furthest extent that we can assume, based upon what we can see here and fathom, is that everything is relational. It's bound within a chain of being. This is what is really, one could call, destiny, or this sort of fatalistic drive. There is control over certain micro or minor actions within that sort of chain, within that tapestry or story, but ultimately the fool, will walk the journey of the major arcana, and he will still end up the fool, right? So it's just this consistent sort of journey. It's this consistent. It's the greatest story ever told, if you will. To sort of take a tangential turn, just to sort of highlight what you were saying and to back up with some quotes. I did find the quotes here. This is from the New Atlantis, from the core philosophy of Salomon's house. This is where all of the philosopher kings meet, the adepts who rule this sort of hidden, sequestered utopia. This is plotting the assimilation of the world onto this global civilization. It states, quote, "The end of our foundation is the knowledge of the causes and secret motions of things, and the enlarging of the bounds of human empire to the effecting of all things possible." And then it goes on to discuss genetic modification. Quote, "We know beforehand of what matter and commixture, what kind of beasts and birds will arise." And then furthermore as well, it discusses something, this is probably the most interesting one, and it's just a very, very short sentence, and it states, quote, "We make artificial rainbows, halos, and circles about light." And it moreover states there's like a total, either total locomotion or total surveillance, right? It depends how one interprets the language. And he discusses that that the society possesses the ability to have some degree of flying in the air, right? Now he doesn't mention contraptions, so it's almost like they're flying in the air, the way he almost describes it. Now, again, we could sort of debate the language of this, but I actually noted this, and I noted this quote for one reason alone. It's almost like the 17th century equivalent, if you will, of a sort of dusty plasma, right? And also the idea of the terahertz frequency grid that many people up to this point have been discussing. And this is the sort of nascent technologies for the biodigital convergence, eventually perhaps leading to plasmate symbiotes, or effectively the elite becoming the new plasma entities of the next world age. Or of course, as well, it's the ability to engineer the atmosphere itself, which perhaps they're doing, and the elite are, accelerating within this accelerationist trajectory towards biodigitalism and becoming, if you will, the new plasma entities, to create a hermetically sealed, hyper-real simulation where even the weather and the visual spectrum that we see, if you will, the craft virtual worlds, are dictated by a sort of, new breed, an evolved breed of new administrators, of godlike administrators, and yes, it also mentions here, by means of our solitary situation and of the laws of secrecy which we have for our travellers and our rare admission of strangers. And then it goes on to touch upon the idea King Solomona implemented prohibitions which we have touching entrance of strangers. So effectively, it's a secret sort of sanctuary that abides here. And just to mention what you were talking about with radiation, which I found a quote there in my notes, where John Keel stated, quote, "We are biochemical robots controlled by radiation. The Earth is a small part of a much larger, invisible structure. We are the property of the intelligence that controls this structure. They can manipulate our minds, create synthetic physical events, and orchestrate our entire reality." And then he goes on to state, quote, "The phenomenon is dependent on belief, and belief is dependent on the phenomenon. It is a closed feedback system. They need our emotional energy, our fear, and our awe. They engineer religious miracles and aerial anomalies purely to harvest the psychic friction generated by the herd." And then this is a quote from Jack Lacan. If you want to make comment on it, I'll just mention it here. "The unconscious is structured like a language. Man speaks then, but it is because the symbol has made him man. Man's desire is the desire of the other," and he capitalizes that word. "It is not the subject who speaks, but language which speaks through the subject. We are spoken to, or we are spoken by the symbolic order." And so this is sort of just touching upon what we've been laying out here. But if you wanted to make comment on that, and just as a sort of quick aside, a question here. Ultimately, for example, with CERN and biodigital convergence, wide body area network, all of this, can we safely say that firstly, these adepts, these elite, are almost assuredly, being instructed by preter-human, aspects beyond man's conscious comprehension, which I'm fairly I'm fairly partial to, because it explains a hell of a lot. It explains why this just does not end, and we'll get into some of the quotes that just, I mean, they're replete that backs this up. That there's a sort of elite that have been chosen by some sort of higher class of being, or what have you, as we call them, plasma entities. And moreover, as well, is it the destiny of these elite to affect the sort of the march of history in this direction, along this sort of vector quantity towards perhaps perfecting the farm itself in which we abide within, or perfecting themselves into a new class of God. And moreover, lastly, how does this tie in with the idea of Genesis that we see with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, where the reason that's Yahweh Elohim, and the Elohim perhaps presumably as well, did not want Adam and Eve to eat from this tree because it made them like gods, right? If they also were to eat from the tree of life, after eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So this idea of the fear of the gods and man becoming a god, or perhaps realizing that he is a god. Um, do you have any comments to make upon that? I know that was a lot of questions. I do apologize.
Yeah, no problem. I'll see if I can wind a way through it here. So in terms of Genesis, I think Hegel has a good just sort of puts it plainly, or really pulls out of the exegeses that when Adam and Eve are said to eat of the knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, it's not the morality of what is good or what is evil. It's the knowledge, right, of good and evil. Because if you ask, well, what is at the basis of the distinction between good and evil? How is this even done? It's done through abstract processes of relating concepts, right? Relating ideas. And that relation requires abstraction. So really, when he says, well, the serpent says, if you eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, ye shall be as gods. And Hegel points out, well, the serpent didn't lie, not here, right? Because they do become as gods, because Yahweh Elohim, he confirms it. He says, behold, now man has become like one of us. So it is the what causes them to fall in the first place is knowledge per se, knowledge in itself, that level of like hyper awareness, that self awareness, that ability to open up distance between the immediate interaction with your environment through like the sensory organs, through the nervous system, and open up a space for like contemplation, to abstract elements of your experience of the world, your consciousness, to abstract, pull out elements of that, and then relate those elements to each other. Because that's what we're talking about when we say good and evil. We're talking about a relation. It's a relation of ideas, right? So in order to relate those ideas, you have to be able to distinguish them and hold them, right, outside of experience. That's essentially what abstraction is you're pulling out ideas from an experience, you're lifting them up out of the raw experience itself, and then you relate them, right? So it's like a vertical relation to that sort of horizontal experience of the world. It's a verticality. And as I mentioned many times, we see this in our physiology. Kant points this out in his physical geography. Most animals are horizontal in their physiological relation to experience. They traverse upon a flat plane. To them, it's a flat plane because almost all of them go on all fours, right? Or majority of their movement, their locomotion is on all fours, which puts them at a horizontal spine. The relation to the earth from a spinal perspective is horizontal. They go at the earth mouth first, which is why they have such high sensory organs, like in the nose, right, with smell and what have you, is they move in a sort of a predative locomotion, mouth first, right? But humans are vertical, and what this does is allows us for this. It allows us to abstract the world. Kant points this out because our orientation to the planet is a vertical orientation. We're allowed to. This assists in that process of um, going about through this abstract process. And interestingly enough, the one of the part of the curse that Yahweh puts on the serpent is it has to go on its belly now. It was vertical, and now he puts them down horizontally to the earth. and that's maybe going down a different rabbit hole there. But the point is, though, is that we're vertical and we have this aspect here. So it is knowledge itself which even allows for the choice, if you will, between good and evil. Now Yahweh ascribes this to himself. This is essentially what makes him divine, is this abstraction, the awareness of good and evil, and then the choice that is allowed to be made between good and evil because you have abstracted them and related them, right? And this is why we're made in the image of God, is that we, in the biblical sense here, by eating of this tree of knowledge, we now, our eyes are opened and we are now like gods. And so we're able to conceive of all these different aspects, but I'm already lost on your other questions. So jump in if you would, and then that's my little quick commentary on Genesis, but you were trying to relate that to what now?
Well, I was going to make a comment on that, which is that interestingly, man is almost man is endowed with that sort of curiosity, which is of course born out of relation, which is why man becomes susceptible to the serpent's temptation, because Yahweh Elohim, uh, by of course creating man and Adam and Eve, well, Eve from Adam, from the side of Adam. What he states is, was that you shall not be alone or something like that. I cannot have you to be alone or something along those lines. So it's almost like Yahweh. What I'm sort of getting at is, it's almost when you read it, Yahweh is creating the foundations for man to eventually sort of awaken into predation. And
Oh,
it's
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's just good Calvinism. That's, as I mentioned, I think in our private discussion the other
yeah.
day, that ran way too long. This is just Calvinism. This is just a proper interpretation of the Bible. Yahweh is the hyper predator. He is the dragon, right? It is one and the same. Whatever deistic mask you want to put on it, whether you call him Baal or Quetzalcoatl or Tizcatlipoca or whatever it is, it's still heading in this. It's still the same general principle when we get down to the basic aspects of it. Is that this isn't the entire biblical narrative, Genesis to Revelation, is being exactly orchestrated by Yahweh. Why did the fall happen? Well, obviously he made the serpent. See, because the Bible says explicitly that God sees the end from the beginning. So he knows all the events that are going to happen, which is what allows for prophecy. But because he knows all the events that are going to happen, he knows them because he has decreed them, right? He doesn't look into the future, see what's going to happen, and then just write out a decree on what's going to happen. That's called infralapsarianism in theology. But the Bible teaches, in my opinion at least, very clearly supralapsarianism. And supralapsarianism means what comes first in the logical order of history is that God writes out the decrees on what is going to happen. I am going to do this, and then I'm going to do this. I'm going to make Adam. I'm going to make the serpent, and I'm going to make the serpent tempt him, and Adam's going to fall. And then, right. So he's writing out the decrees of everything that's going to happen. Because he has decreed it, he also knows, because he's omnipotent, he can make all this happen. He knows what's going to happen in the future. And so, because he knows it's going to happen in the future, because he decrees it, this allows for prophecy. But this also means that he's orchestrating everything, right? And he holds this wisdom or this information on what exactly is going to happen at exactly what times. He holds that with himself, and he disperses it to angels, angelos, right? Messengers who deliver prophecy, or he disperses it in greater amounts to his son, Logos, Jesus Christ, right? But even Christ doesn't know everything that Yahweh knows, because ultimately, since he is the only omnipotent one, he dishes out power in whatever measure he sees fit to cause things to happen. It's all sourced in him. Bible's absolutely clear on that. So yes, he's absolutely orchestrating the entire process because he works with both hands. That's why he says, behold, man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He's aware of both and he orchestrates both, right? But he is going to be the hyper predator, and he's not going to allow anybody to sort of usurp his throne and take that position.
And also to know of the beginning and the end, you would have had to have been the hyper predator, which devoured all of those things, or if you will, internalized them all. Thus allowing, of course, what we see in Genesis in the beginning, where he can then separate them out into their own relational counterparts. He understands if you will, every angle of the object of the beginning and the end, and he knows them all. He knows the entire sort of three-dimensional, full spectrum view of the synthesis of the two.
Yeah.
So ultimately,
And this
it's
is why, yeah,
mhm,
just to jump in, this is
yeah.
why Nick Land has become so partial to Calvinism, and even a lot of even his disposition is being called now in sort of like the cutting edge philosophical discussion on this. It's basically being called like a techno Calvinism is what he's basically being labeled with, because we're able to like relate now and see like, okay, these doctrines of the reformers, which are in my opinion a very faithful interpretation of the biblical text. Nick Land is saying the same thing. It's just he has identified the hyper-predative process, and he identifies it with the expansion or the acceleration of technology, which allows for this hyper-predation. And this is inevitable. It's like a decree set by God, by the hyper-predator, and you can't resist it. So he says, stop resisting it. Just let it happen. Just accelerate. Is his basic disposition.
And this accelerationism, you see in the work of, for example, John Lamb, Not in His Image, where he states, quote, "The archons are intrapsychic mind parasites. They cannot create anything, but they can initiate a vast hyperreal simulation, like what we see with Eden, which I think means in Hebrew it means delight or pleasure. But this itself goes back to the Akkadian Adinu, which I forget what the etymology of that is now, but it goes back to an older Akkadian word as well, Edi or Edin, which means the steppe. So, oh yeah, Edinu meant like a sort of lavish garden, right? It's sort of a, like a pleasure garden or something along those lines. Or it could mean as well an untouched, fertile land. So almost like Arcadia within the Hellenic view of this all, or of course the Latin Golden Age or what have you. And so to manage this simulation, they require human accomplices. They select and infect those human beings who are most disconnected from the organic intelligence of the earth, elevating them into positions of absolute religious and political authority. And in Lovecraft, interestingly, mentions that the sort of the collapse of the hyper-real simulation would be brought about by, if you will, the archons, the rulers, the Elohim, not the El itself. That being the sort of alien or unknown god, the agnostos theos, but of the sort of fractal fragments that are akin to us, but are of course, above us, right? Perhaps in a plasma state. And he states, quote, "The time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have become as the great old ones, free and wild and beyond good and evil." So it's the same idea that we're discussing at the beginning of creation, that for Yahweh to have created, to have, divided everything into twain, and you've got, a multiplicity of examples of that. The first one is in the first line of Genesis, which is, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." Now the earth was formless and empty. So the earth existed, but it was formless and empty, right? Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. So it's almost like nothing is there. Though, for him to have created these things, he had to have some sort of relational counterpart of it, right? It's like a sort of dream or an embryo, right? So these things must have some form of blueprint that one has relationally observed or if you will, interred into their own mind or their own soul or their own psyche, their own being, the fabric of their being. Um, so what it's showing there is that Lovecraft had an idea of that with Beyond Good and Evil. Once the hyper predator which is itself beyond good and evil, had interred all of that duality, had synthesized it all, it could then create its own reality again, right? And it states this: with laws and morals thrown aside, and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy, then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves, and all the earth would be flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. And you see the same thing in both the Sumerian creation myths, interestingly, and the Enuma Elish, the Akkadians as well, and also that of the Book of Enoch with the Nephilim and all of that. It's the same thing that's being mentioned here. And uh, I don't know if you want to make comment on that, if you have any comments to make on that. I don't want to go exhaustively through all of the quotes that I sent you, but just we'll go through a couple just to show that there's some what these esoteric scholars are writing about is there is a sort of transcendent or uh, preter-human sort of college of entities or council of entities, an Elohim, if you will, that sits above mankind, and they choose a select group, a small nation, a cabal, to thus act as managers to dictate the sort of flow of history. I mean, we have as well one example here with you've brought up previously with the Yazidi religion, but we read from their holy book Kitab al-Jilwa, this is chapter 2, quote, I allow not everyone to associate in my knowledge, I think this is Malik Taus speaking, nor do I entrust my secrets to everyone, but only to those who are my beloved and my chosen ones. Interesting use of terminology there. I lead to the straight path without a revealed book. I direct aright my beloved and my chosen ones by unseen means. And then chapter 1 states this, quote, every age has a manager directed by my decree. This office is changeable from generation to generation, so it perinates almost. That the ruler of this world and his chiefs may discharge the duties of their respective offices, everyone in his own turn. I mean, there's literally a multiple. Anyone listening to this, there is a multiplicity of quotes akin to that. That there is a secret college, an adept, an elite that have been selected by a preter-human intelligence. I mean, by a multiplicity, I mean literally hundreds, if not thousands of quotes. I sent you a small smattering of, the ones I had, Eros, in my notes. And I think I must have sent at least 24 quotes or something, you know, and it just keeps reiterating the same point here. I don't know if you have comment to make upon this. I think it points to this conspiracy, if you will, a preter-human conspiracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think you're right over the target, and this is pretty much not necessarily philosophically, but in terms of like historicity, religiosity. This is essentially the core of the matter, the core of our known history, or even our experience as humans in this domain. And that's because there's this very interesting term that Lovecraft uses, right? But you'll also, if you know your philosophy, or if you're just simply aware of Nietzsche, Nietzsche's using the same term, beyond good and evil. And Yahweh within the biblical text is himself also beyond good and evil, as I think I explained in private communication the other day, right? When we were
Mm-hmm.
talking about, right, the omnipotence of God and might makes right, right? Because Yahweh is omnipotent, he has all might, right? Because he's the strongest, he's the most powerful, and he's the smartest, just to put it crassly, no one can hold him responsible for anything. So he's beyond good and evil. Because within the biblical framework, responsibility is to be understood as being held accountable by someone who is more powerful than you to a standard that is set by that power. That's what the definition of responsibility is. It's not the Bible, because it's more of an ancient Near East text is not Platonic in the sense that it's not holding like Plato's world of ideas or world of forms as the ultimate standard, so to speak. So what I mean by this is that in modern Christianity, there's like an idea of justice, or like let's say equality, right? And that all beings must adhere to that standard of justice, even Yahweh, because that standard of justice is above Yahweh in terms of like logical order, right? Where he must adhere to a standard of justice. It's like Plato's idea or form of justice. And as beings manifest, right, in the world, as they descend down this chain of being, Yahweh is essentially second in command, but what is above Yahweh is the world of ideas. That would be a Platonic framework. But the Bible, especially the Old Testament, is not operating off a Platonic framework. It's operating off of a like almost anti-metaphysical framework in that sense. So that it is about power. It's about which individual, which klippa, which isolate intelligence, which being has the highest will to power, and that's the one who sets the standards. Might makes right, right? So that means what is good or what is evil is determined by who is most powerful, not by some Platonic standard on what is good and evil in the abstract, purely abstract realm, but rather what is good and evil is what the boss says is good and evil. That's how the Bible operates. And if you don't understand that sort of that basic axiom, you're just going to misinterpret everything pretty much in the text because you
Well,
need to understand it's operating off of omnipotence.
that absolutely crucial point to state, and this is what I think. This whole Palestine Israel sort of you know I really think it's a form of confusion in the Western populations, even in perhaps the Arab populations, which is that they're not quite understanding. Um, I think it was the UN ambassador from Israel that put it quite aptly, and just sort of spelled it out. He says, "We do not subscribe to Western morality." So the way that
Exactly.
Israel is waging war is entirely within this, and exactly as you stated, an anti-metaphysical framework. It's
Exactly.
it's might
Yeah.
equals right. They're not
Yeah.
holding to a sort of any sort of Platonic ideal of good, of evil, of you know, even of the idea of even a neutral position. That there is none of that. Those who have the power take the crown, and so what people have to understand is what you see with Judaism. Ultimately, when you boil this down, in fact, you can see this within several verses and passages within the Old Testament that I think they forgot to edit out. In fact, I'm almost sure they forgot to edit this out because it shows that, firstly, it's extremely polytheistic, and secondly, it clearly shows that Judaism, one of its primary sources of inspiration, was the Canaanite religion. In fact, it's
Mhm.
probably just an offshoot of it. I mean, one example is this: Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 to 9. Now, this is from the Hebrew. This is a sort of it's the complete Jewish Bible. There's also the Hebrew Bible as well, which is a sort of, it's like an anglicized version of what would be the Tanakh, right? So the nouns are still kept in Hebrew, but this one has the same thing. And what you find, of course, you won't get this from the King James or the English versions because this has been sort of smoothed over, but from the Hebrew, we read, quote, when Elion, or El Elyon, this is the monad, this is this alien god, the Gnostic pleroma, this agnostos theos, gave each nation its heritage, when he divided the human race, he assigned the boundaries of peoples according to Israel's population. But Adonai's, or of course In some translations, it's just Yahweh. Share was his own people, Yaakov his allotted heritage. So what you're, and if you couple that as well with, I think it's Psalm 82, but again, this has been glossed over as well in translations. Yeah, there we go. It states that Elohim presides, or El, or Elion, depending on the translation, presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods, or the Elohim. So, I mean, right away, what this is indicating is, I mean, firstly, we're dealing with effectively a Bronze Age religion, just it's cloaked itself in, hyper-editorialization to hide this fact. And you're dealing with fundamentally a Canaanite or Levantine Bronze Age religion, primarily, which means, as we see from this sort of rugged, inhospitable environment, is it drove them in an evolutionary fashion. It drove them towards that anti-metaphysical view where might equals right. That, if you had to kill someone and steal their food to survive, you did so. You were justified to do so. Funnily enough, there's some other examples of this. I won't name them, but there's some cultures out there that you see that they've went through generations of exploitation and conquest by other nations and other factions and what have you. Could even be religious ideologies and such. And eventually, as a sort of defense mechanism, they start to build up that might equals right. In fact, one example is sort of India. India has the idea of the Jagada, which is that you are, if you will, ethically or morally justified, not in terms of the Western sense of the word, to find loopholes around the law, to skirt around the civic sense of things, right? Now, again, eventually that goes as things modernize and such. But if you have a religion where they are completely inoculated or resistant, extremely resistant to assimilation or osmosis, then that never goes. That anti-metaphysical credo stays intact. And so I think that's a crucial point that you've just brought up.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's what it comes down to, because you'll see this all throughout the Old Testament, and we could just go on and on and on with verses, proof texts for all of this. But just the Hebrews will constantly proclaim our God is a living God, right? And so what they're saying is that, like, he has action in the world, and we cause action, we cause things to occur by his power in the world. And when the prophets will, like, challenge other gods from other nations, it's always a challenge of, what can your God do? Not like, what philosophical system can we construct and what seems to make most logical sense and what has the best explanatory power. They're not, the Hebrews aren't doing that. They're like, all right, well, if our God is the true God, watch our warrior slay your giant, or watch, you know, um, Samson kill 1,000 men with the jawbone of an ass, or watch this fire come down from heaven, this plasma, right? Um, it's about action in the world, will to power, causing things to happen. It's not philosophically sitting around saying, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think your theory is better than my theory. They're not so much concerned with that, right? So it's a very much Bronze Age in that sense of making things happen. And so, and like Daniel 2:37, where the prophet Daniel speaking to the king, he says, "Thou, O king, art a king of kings. For the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, strength, and glory." So see, it's always this direct relation to this being who is, for all intents and purposes, omnipotent, and then he dishes out to who he selects to dish out for his own purposes. He makes this very clear. This is what Moses tells Pharaoh, right? Is that you're doing all this stuff for the glory of our God, and, like, you can't resist it. That's why when Moses confronts Pharaoh, the text says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart against Moses, which means that Moses was saying, hey, Yahweh says, let his people go. Then the text says, but God hardened his heart, which means that, like, he made him bear down and say, I'm not going to let your people go. Why? So God could show all these physical plagues these plagues that he induces into the world, locust swarms, boils, all this other stuff. He causes disease, he causes locust swarms, which is Apollo, right? Lord King of the mice, right? So you have, he's bringing disease, he's bringing famine, he's bringing all of these destruction, which is Apollo, which is the sun, right? Sun god. So he's he hardened Pharaoh's heart to cause this whole Exodus event to happen. So in this sense, Yahweh is omnipotent. It's absolutely critical to understand this, so that when he does select a group of individuals or an individual or sets up a king, the entire um, biblical framework in which that is seen is that this king is set up to fulfill the purposes of Yahweh. Now, what you'll always see is like the common denominator of what's happening is that it is maintaining or increasing a predatory environment, right? It's causing extra selective pressures in a nested network of humanity. So what do I mean by that? Like Yahweh will set up an elite and bless them, right? With power, essentially, to do things in the world, both with the knowledge and insight to do it, and then the actual sort of ability to actually cause it to come to pass. But then what he does is you essentially have the mass of humanity, which is essentially fuel for the flames, right? Um, and then you'll have like a nested hierarchy in which it's different levels of testing or predation or selection pressures that are placed on them. So even for the elite, and you'll see this all throughout the Old Testament, the elite, the kings, the prophets, David, they're always in this process of like extra selection pressure. And then whether or not they will sort of pass that test, see what the lesson is, or in some way evolve further on through the nested hierarchy. So I sort of take that as well with even today's current elite, is that you'll have you seem to have like a hierarchy of elite where you might have someone like a Biden or something like this, or Trump or whatever, where these guys are just like frat boys, George Bush and stuff like that, and they like to party, and they're in the right bloodlines, because a lot of this does relate to bloodlines, Rh negativity, things of that nature. um they're in the right bloodline, but they're sort of like that outer rung of the Russian doll, where they're given a certain amount of power, authority, and access and information, but they're not actually in alignment with that predatory disposition. They just want to party, and they're going to do what they're told, so to speak. So they become fuels for the flame as well. And what it's doing essentially is it's creating a pyramidal structure of predation, but it's the entire planet being pulled to this attractor of essentially forced evolutionary progress down a certain vector towards a hyperpredation, um, which I believe happens in a cyclical basis. And it's what's essentially doing is that it's an attractor toward the Negredo, right, stage, which most of humanity won't even get to, because they're not even thinking about any of this stuff, right? 95% of humanity is just, it's right over their head. They don't understand really any of these sort of deeper meanings to things, why things are happening. And then for that other very small percentage that even understand, then you have selections out of that elite into higher and higher castes. And so nobody is even into the Negredo stage. The Negredo stage is like Mainlander, maybe Nietzsche, especially towards the end of his life, right? Maybe Heidegger toward the end of his life, right? It's this Negredo stage that you have to pass through, where it's this complete dissolution. And that's where you begin to see um, that sort of state beyond good and evil, which is essentially entering into the mindset, or a similar frequency in a literal sense, of Yahweh, of the hyper predator, because you're beginning to see that metaphysical overlay that goes over the world for the purpose of producing narrative and mythopoeia to drive mankind as a herd essentially toward a certain vector. And that is a state of dissolution. It's sort of like that vomit. It's that coagulation or that dissolution leading towards a coagulation, because you have to pass sort of through this process of understanding how the world actually is, right? And because what you're then beginning to see it from is you're beginning to see it from a picture that is not so clouded by narrative and purely abstract ideas. And you're starting to see the world in more of a, perhaps we would say, Bronze Age mindset, right? Where you're starting to see things as they are, as they interact, right? And then you have choices to make. And that's where that Negredo stage can go really bad for an individual. Or perhaps there's a passing through of the Negredo, right? But what you're doing is you're sort of entering into yourself a priest class. You're entering into a privileged class of understanding. And one of the main drivers that leads mankind towards that gate or towards that threshold of Negredo is trauma, is pain, because trauma and pain pushes the organism to that point of that like abyss. It pushes you there, because what trauma does, trauma and fear, it pulls you out of sort of that abstract realm and puts you directly in the moment and the experience of sort of like the real, as Lacan would put it, like this direct sort of experience with the moment, because you're in pain or you're in fear. And the Bible even says this. What does it say? It says, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, of knowledge, right? Trauma is this traumatic state of anxiety and suffering and pain is the beginning of understanding what's actually happened.
And
And if you
and that
haven't got there, if you're running from that constantly, like the Buddhists or the Christian, if you're running from fear and suffering, you're moving away from this disposition. But fear, anxiety, and suffering, what is that? That's nature. That's perturbation, right? That's what the sun does. That's what the earth realm is. It is a realm of fear, anxiety, and suffering, which is going to push you to the Negredo or just recycle you essentially back into this process and push you back again to the Negredo.
and this also explains as well this fear. Um, what we find is within Genesis with the temptation of Eve, that it makes sense that this is why this fear would be. This is why fear and temptation are almost joined at the hip. And you also see this in sort of the Baudrillardian society in which we inhabit, um, wherein we we have this pull towards non-being. We're constantly looking for escapism from reality itself. That eventually we want to inhabit a simulacra that fundamentally has no sort of, though it may look like a reality, it has no connection. It's entirely detached and disconnected from that reality, which exists tangibly, which if makes effect upon us. And so you ultimately it's people wanting to live within a sort of simulated Eden, where um, where they can insulate themselves from the consequences of escaping from reality, from if you will, rejecting reality, from ignoring reality, and at the same time living within a sort of perpetual present where they don't have to necessarily, like what you're saying, perinate with the perturbative or cycles of suffering, right? That which affects change, which effectively galvanizes us and tempers our being and pushes us forward. Um, there was something else I was going to mention, which is you find in the book of Exodus. Now, again, this sort of relates to the plasma entity that may be Yahweh. You also see as well where the Hebrews mention that our God is a consuming fire. They mention it several times. And they also describe him as radiant as the sun, but also he makes his hiding place within the dark abyss, essentially, within the dark mist, the canopy of darkness, pardon. So what you have is a sort of black sun deity almost, right? He's of both things. Isaiah 45 verse 7. I Yahweh create both the light and the dark, good and evil. I, the Lord, do all these things, right? But then he states this in the book of this is the book of Exodus. This is the Latin is flagror non consumor, which means I burn, but I'm not consumed. It also can be nec tamen consubator, yet it was not consumed. So the bush burned, yet it was not consumed, right? So it went through this perturbative, if you will, trial, this suffering, this sort of what the other word be, sort of an immolation, but it was not affected. Now, there's two ways to interpret that. That it is, of course, a metaphor for Yahweh himself as a sort of metaphysical being, that he is the consuming fire, like the predator, which takes things unto himself and then utilizes that like life to thus blossom new things into being. And of course, another sort of aspect, it could be that everything that he's doing is creating a sort of light show. It's not real, right? Because we all know within the tangible world, fire would burn that tree, that bush, that shrub, but it did not. So it's almost like Yahweh, similar to the powers that be, deal in the abstract because they know people want to exist within a non-beingness of state. If you sort of ramp up the trauma enough, once you ramp up the trauma enough, the fear of the Lord, if you will, they are more susceptible to temptation. And this is a very, very interesting thing because it's getting back to Yahweh and Satan are fundamentally the same characters. In fact, I put it in that book, Yahweh is Satan, where, you start drawing parallels between the Old and the New Testament. And even you brought it up as well, very interesting, where, the Hebrews, even Yahweh, is said to have stated on several occasions in the Tanakh, Torah, where he states that I gave you this kingship, right? If you serve me, I will give you great riches, this kingship, this land, a land flowing of milk and honey. I will give you all these things, right? And that's exactly what you see with Satan. And when Jesus is in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, he makes the same temptation. And what do we read? I think it's in Romans. The Lord of this world is Satan, right? Satan is the god of this world, the Lord of this earth. And interestingly, Yahweh is
And
the
so
same
is
thing.
Melektos.
And
So
so is
is Melektos.
Malektos. Yes.
He's the Lord of the world, and this is, people don't understand this either. They think that within the Christian context that Jesus was incarnated, became a man for the purpose of redeeming his people because it was an act of pure selflessness, right? That he just emptied himself and was incarnated, and but that's not what the text says. The text is very clear, both in the Gospels and then in the rest of the New Testament too, that Jesus was promised reward by Yahweh for his sacrifice. I have to find this text. I'm a little, I'm rusty. Remember, this is from years ago and stuff, but I have to. But it speaks essentially of an inheritance for Christ, which is his people. But that he says, in the Garden of Gethsemane, he's praying and he basically says, I have kept those that you have given to me, right? Like I basically I did what you wanted me to do, right? And then he says, therefore glorify thou me with the glory which I had with thee, right, before the world was. So what he's saying is, he's saying like, hey, it's a contractual agreement. It's like, hey, I came and I did this. Now I'm calling on you to hold up your end of the deal, right? You said you go do this, redeem these people to me, back to Yahweh, and I will glorify you, right? And I will make thine enemies your footstool, right? To rest your
Mm.
feet upon. And that's what all this image is in like you get a lot of this imagery in the book of Revelation, right? When Christ is said to return in his second coming, he's riding upon this horse, and on his thigh, or on his vestments, which are dipped in blood, on his vestments it says King of Kings, Lord of Lords, right? Now he has been given this. Paul says this in Hebrews and in other places as well. This is a title of like this conqueror, the four horsemen, Apollo, right? Um, this is this title of conqueror that he is given. He's flying under the banner of Yahweh. He is his essentially supreme ambassador because he takes his name upon him. You'll see this all throughout the Bible. If you have the name of Yahweh, right? We come in the name of the Lord, in the name of Yahweh. So if you have gone through processes of trauma, right? If you've gone through stages of Negredo, which is, we can get a picture of that, like with the Garden of Gethsemane. If you go through these processes, he sort of puts his stamp on you, and you essentially become like this elite warrior for for Yahweh, going forth, conquering and to conquer, right? In this entire process of predation. So the whole it's all these contracts that you'll constantly see, which you rightly relate to like Satan and his temptation of, hey, do this and I will give you this, right? Do that and I will give you this. It's all these contractual agreements there as well.
And you also see that with, interestingly, Hammurabi. I mentioned this in my Blood on the Sand book when you trace back the Amorites. Interestingly, Amuru was known as the Lord of the Steppes, and the Amorites were said to have come from the steppes, right? They were sort of nomadic peoples. They were, it's one Akkadian text calls it, I think, the Curse of Akkad, or something like that. And it mentions that they are the boors of the mountains, right? Like they do nothing, they build nothing. They are pastoralists. They also live off raiding and pillaging, and they eat their meat raw, right? And all of these things, right? Obviously, you can tell the Acadians didn't really like this nomadic pastoralist group, but eventually, once they conquered the Acadians and the Sumerians, the third dynasty of Ur, later on, they did so through effectively subversion, right? The mass immigration. They also would, because they were pastoralists, and of course the Akkadians and Sumerians were that of agriculturalists, settled sedentary agriculturalists. Um, the Amorites realized that, well, if we dam the rivers, right, the canals, we also send our cattle on to graze on their fields, right? And to destroy the sort of the agricultural base of the civilization. We can simply take them over that way. We can, if you will, have a monopoly on food, and by that we can, sort of exert leverage over these empires, and eventually, over hundreds of years, they eventually took over them and founded the Old Babylonian Empire. But interestingly, what you find with the Old Babylonian Empire is, well, firstly, the first Babylonian ruler was uh, what was it? Sumulael was his name, which is of course Samuel. And the third, I think it was the third emperor of the old Babylonian Empire, was Hammurabi. And what was Hammurabi very famous for? Well, that of laws, right? He created the code of Hammurabi, the oldest law code. And everything within that is this sort of equation, right? It's all about accountancy, an eye for an eye, essentially. That's what you find through it. It's actually not as radical as the commandments in the Old Testament, but as the law in the Old Testament, the mitzvah. But you can see the mitzvah is sort of very much inspired from it, and I actually made a lot of sort of comparisons between the two, and I showed how effectively, though the Hebrew is, I would think, more radical, the mitzvah is more radical, the Hammurabi Code sort of lays the foundation for all of this. And it's this same idea of predator and prey, of equanimity or equation, trying to find balance, to maintain society as a sort of organism of a hyper predator, to thus have a basis to attack other adjacent neighboring tribes and conquer them, and also to maintain the sort of hierarchy itself. So it's not necessarily about justice; it's about the deterrence against against any antagonization against the status quo, or any angst against the status quo. This is interesting. Hammurabi itself, you can actually break the etymology of that down to father of the masters, because obviously rabbi means my master. So father of the rabbis, or father of the masters. And I went into that in my book. And what's interesting about this is back to Eden. Eden, Edenu, is where mentioned from Akkadian. It means this. It can mean the untouched, fertile land, but in its earlier etymological root, Edi or Edin, it meant steppe, the place of the steppe. And the Amorites are associated with the steppe, right? And then you can trace that down to the Hyksos, and then of course to the Canaanites and the Israelites and what have you. So what you're seeing here is, well, firstly, there's a cultural continuity here. There's a continuity of sort of a metaphysical view, or a view of political science and how to conquer, and how one must sort of, carry themselves within the world, to this idea of might equals right. But you also find as well, I've lost my train of thought. There's something I was going to mention. Jesus, it's went out of my mind. Yes, that's it. So so if you look at any sort of Christian altar, what's that place, that the lectern, right? Every one that I've seen, I was in Portugal recently as well. I've been there several times, and you've got the Cristo Rei, right, which is basically it's a carbon copy of the one in Rio de Janeiro, with Christ on top of this high plinth overlooking the entire Lisbon city. And at the base of that, you have the four the four apostles by which the Gospels are named after. That itself, interestingly, I was in a local abbey. I won't give the name of it because it's near where I live. But at the lectern, you had the four, not the four gospel writers, but the four, what would you call them? The four royal stars, the four animals of that you see on the World Tarot
Cherubim.
card. The
Yeah.
cherubim, yes, that's the word. And so what you're seeing here is that stamp that you were mentioning is almost like a squaring of the circle. And what does that mean? Well, when we understand that Deuteronomy 33, verses 8 to 9 passage, where you have this distinction between El Elyon, which, if you will, is the circle, the heavenly, that extinguished itself, it sort of let itself out in a fragmentary fractal, and that itself birthed the sons of God. Then, of course, the sons of God are the squares, right? They are the things that stamp their presence upon that circle. They create the hyper-real simulation themselves. I don't. Sorry, I went on a bit of a ramble there, but I don't know if you have any comment to make on that.
Yeah, I mean, that four too. I just posted in the little chat we have here. It's a picture from it's one of the cards from the Solabuska Taroki, and
Mm-hmm.
it's of Alexander the Great. And you'll notice the four cherubs, if you will. Now, more of an ancient, I believe it derives more from Mesopotamia, but the griffin, which is what Alexander's here surrounded by, the four griffins is sort of like a type, if you will, of the cherubs, because it's just it's a chimera. It's a chimerical being, right? So you'll see these chimerical beings a lot in Mesopotamian art, but they're always like, flanking or along with the gods, or sort of like in a protective mode of someone who's an elite or chosen. And so here in Solabusca, you have Alexander, and he's got the four cherubs, if you will, on all four sides of him. If you look at his crown, that's like a corona. So here's Apollo, essentially incarnate, right? Because Apollo has that crown, which is the Statue of Liberty, right? Same crown that you see on the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty, I think, is Apollo. It's not really Prometheus or maybe somebody else. I think my opinion is that it's Apollo. And notice as well, though, in his right hand, he has the sword, and notice its tilt, right? Just about 23.5 degrees, I would say, right?
I was just about to mention that because it's the same tilt that you see within the staffs of Nicholas Poussin's Et, Et in Arcadia Ego. It's the same
Mm-hmm.
tilt.
Yep. And then notice, so Solabusca, as I know you've been through Peter Mark Adams' work on it. So what we're looking at in these cards is we're looking at every possible detail. Everything is intentionally done. And if you'll notice, he has his right foot on a hill or a mountain. And so it's this idea, as well as Yahweh comes down upon the mountain, right? Or mankind builds a mountain, a pyramid, right? And he comes down upon that pyramid as well. So it's just mountainous because it's this sort of physical structure reaching up towards the heavens where he is. Our God is in the heavens, and he hath done whatsoever he hath pleased, right? I believe that's from the Song of Moses, right? So he's in the heavens. In his left hand, he holds the earth with the four directions, relating to, yes, the cardinal stars, the points, and then that center point being that fifth one, which is known as the fifth watcher, which is the pole star, right? You have the four royal stars, and then the fifth is the pole star, which are the four elements, and then the fifth element of like breath or spiritus or ether, which is what we derive from the pole star. That's that plasmatic influence upon the world. He holds it in his hand. It's also the gates of the sun, and Plato's gates of the sun, or what have you, as Peter Mark Adams points out. And then he's wearing a cap, and the cap is made of, like, it looks like it's like a serpentine cap. You can see the scales on it, right? So his head is possessed by this draconian serpent dominion over his mind, which controls the rest of his body and his will, and then crowned with that Apollyon crown. And he's holding the sword by which he conquers the earth is that pole star relation. So this is going to bring everything back to Draco, as it's always going to go back to. It's always going to go back to the north, right? And this is Alexander the Great, remember, whose mother allegedly mated with some kind of draconic,
Yeah.
right, some kind of
And
draconic beings. Go ahead.
she also knew, I believe, as well, that he was dead because there was an omen of what was it, an eagle eating a serpent or something like
Hmm.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, and you'll notice, and you'll see this a lot in Solabusca. I don't think Peter Mark Adams points this out. Maybe he doesn't. I've just forgotten. But a lot of the characters, but here especially Alexander, is he's wearing red and purple clothing, representing the process of alchemy past the Negretto, right? Past the black and white stage, and this is that the stage of where one goes through the Negretto, recoagulates through the albedo, through the white, and then enters into this stage now where they become this hyper predator, if you will, because you have to get past the abstract illusions and that dissolving of these principles that keep men in check through the dichotomies, through the um, uh, dualities of, like, good and evil, and like true and false and what have you. When those begin to dissolve and coagulate and mix together, you are going beyond good and evil, a la Nietzsche, right? A la Yahweh, right? Who is beyond good and evil. So you're becoming more like this, right? And so he's taking on this red and purple because it's symbolizing a stage where he's gotten past this and entering into this agent of might makes right. He becomes the weapon that is swung, right? He becomes that which is cutting through and doing this work. Because in order to do that, you can't be caught in ideas of like, well, the biblical text was actually this, and the Norse text, and they changed this and they did this, and okay, yeah, that's all there, and it's painting a narrative and a mythopoeia, but it's teaching and leading and goading humanity into certain directions, and most of humanity, like I said, never even comes to Negredo. It never even gets close, right? But then at that Negredo stage, that step, that Negredo stage will dissolve you, and it either leads to madness and schizophrenia. Um, I don't know what the proper term would be that would not get things blocked, but deletion, right? Right,
Yes.
or
Unalivement.
extreme, yeah, unalivement, right? Or like an extreme nihilism, a paralysis, in which the person becomes paralyzed in the Negredo and oftentimes retreats to fantasies like Buddhism, fantasy, nirvana, fantasies like salvation, or fantasies of like sort of a denial of actual events, like that things are actually happening, that will to power has power in the world and causes things to happen. It's sort of a denial of the whole process, because the Negredo has begun at least maybe parts of dissolving. So you'll see this a lot in the conspiracy world, right? Or people who do like a lot of researching or a lot of philosophy, they will butt up against this Negredo stage when you start to like get into the nitty gritty of research on stuff. And then you'll see them retreat to like the fakeologist or whatever it's called, right? Of like, well, they don't actually have any power and it's all like illusions and they just, and all this other stuff, because they're denying the actual calling down of the fire from heaven, if you will, to strike the earth and mold and terraform the earth. They're saying, well, that power is not really there. We're just sort of granting, by us participating, we're granting them this power. No, these are people who have gone through these processes of trauma. Usually, it's intergenerational trauma or what have you. And through this intergenerational trauma, they are entering into positions of power and effect in the world, right? They're not just on the abstract. You see, you'll get into Negredo, you start to step a foot into Negredo, and you pull and retreat to abstract. And according to this selection process, you're too weak. You don't have that flame within. So that if you do run into Negredo, it sort of just washes you out. It's like special forces training for the military, like the Navy SEALs or SAS. They're trying to wash guys out. They're trying to see who's got it and who doesn't have it. And I'm a big military historian buff kind of guy, and you know, it's more of a personal story. But I was gonna get into like military special forces stuff before I came down with a severe illness when I was 19. That's a different story. But I was really into it, right? So I read everything on it and used to train and all kind of crazy stuff and run countless miles and all this other stuff. But the point is, though, what I'm getting to is that having looked at all this stuff, the guy in selection for these elite special forces, it's called selection, by the way. What they're trying to do is they don't care who's the fastest, who's the strongest, who's the smartest. You do have to have certain aptitudes in those areas. What they're looking for is something that they, even to this day, really can't pin down, and they don't know who has it, and they don't know who doesn't have it. They can't really like select guys from their history, from anything. It's just a guy gets in there, and out of 100 guys, 10 or 20 of them just have this spirit about them where they are like, more suffering, please. And I don't care what suffering you bring against me. I don't care what perturbation you put against me. I'm going to conquer and come through this phase. Broken legs, broken arm, doesn't matter what it is. I'm not going to quit. I'm going to keep moving forward in this process. It's the exact same thing. It's like, oh, I'm entering into Negredo now. Bring it on. Right. And most of humanity, out of the 100, there's only 10. Heraclitus says this as well in one of his fragments. He says, if you have 100 warriors, he says like 80 of them are just targets. And then he says like 9 of them, they're like they're the true warriors, you know, and they make the battle. And then he says, but there's one, and one is like the hero. He's like the penultimate warrior, and he's the one who decides basically the victory of the battle. He's the one who brings those other 9 or 15 guys who are the true warriors. He brings them home through his heroism and his determination. And Heraclitus is saying the same thing, right? That this, if anybody even gets to Negredo, most wash out. And it's a selection process, this entire realm, because it's selecting to make people like Alexander, right? Because people like Alexander, they, like Mithras, they grab that wheel of the procession, right? And they spin and they crank that wheel and they move the machinery of the aeons toward a certain direction, right? And so going back to maybe, I don't know, 45 minutes ago, whatever it was, in terms of talking about like the elite and their role and selection or what have you, this is that process. Oh, and I remember brought this up. You were talking about the cherubim, right? And that brought to mind this Solobuska card.
Yeah.
And these cherubim, yeah, are these beasts that are around the throne of Yahweh, right? And they sort of dictate and can grant power, especially if you look into certain Jewish texts, to people and factions of the earth that comes ultimately from Yahweh, which is this draconic hyper predator.
Which is of course as well what Adam states that he talks about was a cosmology of predation, and he also discusses as well. And this is interesting because when I was reading a Game of Saturn by Adams, he discusses the Saturnian Brotherhood and this sort of what does he call them, a sort of a serpent dragon or draconic. There's another term he uses, but a draconic bloodline, and he discusses that it utilized what he described as almost a pagan theurgical or a astral magical system to effectively preserve and expand their vast wealth, their power, and their control. And I found it interesting when he discussed that you know he made the connection between Baal Hamon, Kronos, Saturn, the biblical Moloch, which is basically just a title for king, which was the Canaanite either Baal deity or Yahweh or what have you. There was another tribe in the vicinity that had a similar deity. I forget his name now. It's the same idea, and you know it's that sort of metaphysical demiurge, right? The mind itself, which it's fixated on might equals right, hyper-predation, but it utilizes that abstraction principle of like what you're saying, relation, um, basically dialecticism. And I found it interesting when he talked about the pagan aspect of it, and you've brought up there with the hill that he's standing on, this Alexander character in that tarot card, and Gemistos Plethon, who was he was labeled as the last Hellene, but he was I believe he was a Neoplatonic philosopher, but he was very, very ensconced in you know the idea of the classical Hellenic gods, ancient mystery, wisdom cults like Zoroaster, the Magi's, all types of sort of esotericism, and in his work, I think it was called the Book of Laws. So they're similar to Crowley and similar to these laws again. The Book of the Law, and you know the Hammurabi idea. The law, it's you know land, air, and water, if you will, and then also the nomoi. And he discussed within that a sort of idea that basically they had to rebirth the Byzantine Empire following a type of a utopian Hellenic system of government, right? And it was to be based out of Mistras. Now, Mistras is a very interesting place, right? It's of course it was part of mystery cults themselves, but etymologically, Mistras can mean a couple of things. So it can mean to be a master or to dominate, but if you trace it all the way back, found within the medieval chronicle of Morea, you find that Mizithras or Mistras was named after its geographical location and the terrain, because it was a rounded, pointed shape of the hill, which looked like a mound of cheese, right? Or, if you will, a wheel of cheese. So it actually looks uncannily similar to the mound that, of course, he's resting his foot on. But interestingly as well, we also read as well from Gemistos Plethon that, and I'll just get the quote here, where it would be, yeah, here we go. This is from Nomoi. This is where the George of Trebizond mentions this, pardon, from in his book Comparatio Platonis et Aristotelis. This is folio volume 63. Quote, I myself heard him at Florence. This is he heard Gemistos Plethon, asserting that in a few more years the whole world would accept one and the same religion, with one mind, one intelligence, and one teaching. That's very interesting, almost like a biodigital convergence, if you will. And when I asked him, Christ or Muhammad's, he said, neither, but it will not differ much from paganism. And then he goes on to state that I was so shocked by these words that I hated him ever after and feared him like a poisonous viper. Interestingly, right? He uses the snake analogy. And I could no longer bear to see or hear him. I heard too from a number of Greeks who escaped here. That's from, after Constantinople fell and the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Rome collapsed, who escaped here from the Peloponnese, that he openly said before he died that not many years after his death, Muhammad and Christ would collapse, and the true truth of the world would shine through every region of the globe. So, I mean, obviously the truth itself was the idea that you're seeing in that Sola Busca card, and of course that Mark Adams mentions, right? Which is effectively leading towards a cosmology of predation. Eventually, this would come to light. People would be you would have the creation of a controllable toroidal engine. I think that's what they're working towards as a sort of administrator class. They want to create their own toroidal engine to almost invigorate themselves as hyper predators and to elevate themselves to that point. Um, and purely biological. Thus, they believe that they may be able to escape entropy to some degree, or the grasp of entropy.
Yeah, and on that point, to jump in, I think that may be where the test lies for the elite, and they may be in a process of failing, only because if they think that they can sort of make this separate, isolate world, or they could escape from biology into a purely digital space or purely digital form of existence or interaction, at least from my personal understandings and convictions at this point, that this would be them failing the test. Now, in failing this test, what they are doing is driving the environment towards extreme selective pressure, right? For everybody else and on the planet. It's extreme selective pressure. And in the sense that, like, not only with the media or the communication abilities we have, where just the amount of misinformation and psyop and opinions is just, it's already vomit, right? Right, it's already in that place of pure negretto on, like, online and everything else, where it's very, very difficult to parse a lot of things out, especially with AI now and everything. Let alone the um collapse of the environmental structures, all the weather issues. We got volcanoes, we got earthquakes, we got massive storms, fires. I mean, everything is literally falling apart. The economy's crashing. We've got the war and everything else that's going to bring everything down, at least for the time being. So this is all putting extensive pressure, and it may be because that they are their role is sort of this pinnacle of perturbation on the planet, on mankind, to push the planet in a certain direction. But it may be that their obsession with escape, right, into a digital space, if that is not just a screen or a cover for what they're doing, if that is actually their intention, I would say that this would be a failure to interact with the environment in a correct process. Ultimately, like most of humanity, they're trying to escape. They're just billionaires, and they have a lot of power, and so they think that through the power that they have, they can escape nature, right? That they can get out of nature to some extent large enough to avoid this grinding process. Um, so that may be their test. And then in their obsessive pursuit of that escape, they're sort of dragging everything into this point of collapse. Now, this may have some relation with what we see as like cyclical, sort of apocalyptic or destructive cycles that would appear to be, by my research, I could be wrong, that would appear to be outside of the hands of humanity. And by that, I mean, like, while we may be playing some role in bringing about cyclical processes of destruction, we're not like the main arbiters of it. We don't get to push the button to initiate or conclude any of that process, that it is done by greater powers, if you will, driven primarily by the celestial environment, and that it is sort of on a clock of resets and destructions because the elite, as through each aeon, have sort of this ultimate test that they get to, which puts everybody else in an ultimate test, if you will, of generating mass suffering, destruction, and what have you. And if there's if there's excessive failure that's happening in going through this process, that we get a swipe. The slate is sort of wiped clean, at least in to some extent, to start sort of the process over again. Not entirely sure on that. Definitely want to hear your opinions on that. But it would seem that there's like celestially driven cataclysms that are outside of their reach and maybe causing more panic, as if their intention is to escape, that they are on a timer now, which would show that they're willing to possibly go through certain stages of human evolution and development through these sort of alchemical stages, but they are ultimately failing to a certain extent. I don't know. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think the sort of demarcation that you made there, which is the sort of political salesman class, not necessarily the administrators or the managers or the elite, um, which have perhaps, as Mark Adams states, that was the term, the draconic current. So they've got that link with the draconic current. Um, that's see, I agree with you in regards to what we're seeing from the likes of, let's say, Brian Johnson, right? I mean, these people are slaves and useful idiots, just as much as any sort of peon that works in the field. Um, which of course includes ourselves, right? I'm not saying that from a position of greater vantage, but um, so the what you're seeing there is ultimately capital has made them mad. It's driven them to believe, well, I have all of this pleasure and this delight, this Eden, if you will. Why can't I have the Eden of immortality as well?
Mhm.
And of course, this pushes them towards that. This is already hard coded within the system of capital and capitalism. All of capitalism itself, and of course, communism is just a sort of outgrowth of it, a bit like pity is an outgrowth of the uh, um, predatory predilection, which is that capitalism mathematically will lead towards the creation of a hyper-predator. Why? Because
Mhm.
ultimately it will lead towards a, a sort of uni-corporation, which will establish a pure oligopoly, not just over markets themselves, but over political power. And ultimately, to sort of break this all down, the entire system is mathematically engineered through fiat currency, through usury, through money, through all of the various symbols and the construction of language, which thus shapes the terrain of the mind, to lead us down a certain directional pathway by which, of course, these cycles can be brought about. It's the likes, like what you're saying with the great conquerors such as Alexander and such. These are to bring about the unveiling, the unfolding of the world age. It's to bring about ultimately Loosh. And the way I described
Mhm.
Loosh in that video is the electronic, the emotion, the electronic motion that basically brings people into the drama as either a participant or an audience member or both. And it's to keep the sort of cycles going, um, which of course leads to a grander, a grander sort of conclusion to the whole play. But this is all, I think there's ultimately a managerial class that has that direct link, if you will, and to sort of steal Adam's idea, with that draconic current, which they are being told what to do, right? They
Mhm.
are being told, you do this, you do that, you cajole them, you put in place this institution, be it money or academia, some sort of religion, an ideology, whatever it may be, to thus
Right.
push them in that direction. Ultimately, it's the managers themselves that are out with the cycle. If you were to think of it, think of the plasma as or the plasma entities, the whatever term we want to use, this preter-human
Mhm.
aspect. That is the sort of solar source of the thermodynamic exchange within this economy that's going on. They themselves would be the sort of satellite uh, they would be the satellite of the earth, the satellite of the society in which has been established, the political class that are under them, the not the political class, the manager class that are under this sort of plasma entity or preter-human aspect. So ultimately, they regulate what goes on down here. They themselves are regulated by, in that chain of being, by the preter-human aspect. So ultimately, both of those forces are out with the perturbative cycles that happen on Earth. It would appear Earth is like a toroidal engine, is a self-contained unit. Um, what I think's going on here, at potentially a deeper aspect, and this is why I'm sort of racking my mind around this, is are they attempting to sort of, rebel against the draconic current, the managers, that is, the elite, that, beyond the political classes and what have you, even beyond the hierarchy itself, right? Are they attempting to sort of rebel against them to create their own sort of self-enclosed, hermetically sealed, energetic, thermodynamic system? Or are they simply, doing this because they're being promised immortality? True immortality, not what, the likes of Brian Johnson are trying to go uh,
Mhm.
for, which is like a form of vampiric parabiosis, stealing the
Mhm.
blood of young people and stealing their organs and cloning people. And what they're looking, what the higher echelons I think are looking towards, which is the elite, those who are actually ruling things multi-generationally, multi-epochally, if that's even a term. They're being promised to become sort of plasma entities themselves, to become one of the gods if they simply do their bidding. Um,
Mhm.
I think that's what's going on there. I think ultimately the Sumerians and the Akkadians had it right, which is that the gods just want to keep this thing going as long as possible, because as a plasma entity, once you reach that state, you actually haven't escaped entropy. You're still
Correct. Mm.
subject to it. And in fact, you're even more susceptible to it. Now, it does give you the advantage of, because you're beyond the bounds of biology, you can, like we see with Yahweh, the hyper predator, you can be within these sort of liminal states between, beyond good and evil, not just between it, beyond good and evil, beyond the duality. So therefore, that provides you, extreme an extreme mode of calculation, of a strategic mind, right? But also as well, um, because of that, you don't necessarily have your own. You have no ability. You have no dynamic core, no dynamo by which you can create your own light or life, if you will, your own vitality. So you must sap that from somewhere else. So you become almost like an undead vampire lord in a sense. Um, and I think that's what's going on at a deeper aspect. And the idea that you see within the elite and the mystery religions of, oh, we're going to reach the utopia. They've promised us this. I think this draconic current, if you will, this Tetzcatlipoca, this Choronzom, this dweller in the abyss that have promised them so much, if they just simply, go along with this, and perhaps has provided them longevity of life and things such as that, kingship, all of this, um, that itself is a lie, but it's a grander lie in terms of, um the
Yeah, it's
longevity
it's
of
it.
this
Yeah,
epoch.
it's nested because you have the lies for like
Yeah,
the common man, right? But then for the elite, it's sort of on a different order because they have different understanding and involved. Their relation to the world and other humans and everything is just completely different than like our relation, everyone else's relation. So then, if the reality is, look at, let's just say the actual base reality is constant perturbation, constant flux, constant contraction and expansion, right? And this is the cycle of the cosmos and nature. So that then, if there are entities, higher order beings, as Peter Mark Adams calls them, these higher order beings or entities, if they already know this, right, then if they tell an embodied elite class who they've supported over centuries and millennia that you can escape this process if you do X, Y, and Z, right? Even though they themselves know that there is no escape from the process because they're pretty much at the top of the food chain and they see there's no escape. There's still hunger. That sort of base will, Schopenhauerian will of the universe for hunger, right? And so, and they're like these higher order beings would be very intimate with that being in the state that they are in. So if they tell the managerial elite that you can't escape, then would that not be functioning as a selection pressure for the managerial elite?
yeah,
Right, because it's a perturbation, it's a test, if you will, to see if will they be able to fully walk through that negretto stage, right? To see that like, no, 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 there is no escape. And any um concept of escape that you can banter about in your mind or reason with, this is just the uncomfortability of that constant flux that you are in coming out of that like that negretto state. and you and if you think that you can get away from it, you are failing that selection pressure, right? And this is why I've been pondering this for some time. I mentioned this in a talk I think some time ago, where I was mentioning like, is sort of like the general teleology, and I know Nietzsche would hate me for this, right? And it's like, oh, that's metaphysics, but like, is the general teleology of the cosmos then, as let's say an engine, if you will, almost this contraction expansion engine of what it means to exist at all, have any form of being, is the general teleology of that then demiurgic production? And so it is sort of like selection pressure all the way down, and that then
exactly.
the production of the demiurge You only can get to that state because you are so in tune with nature that no matter what anybody sort of like tells you in an abstract sense, you're able to pass through those selection pressures and say like, no, there is no escape. Right? Like, and if you tell me that through technology and look at regeneration and stem cell research, you can come up with all this other stuff, but ultimately the house wins, right? At the end, because of the Heraclitean flux, which is necessary for being in the first place, right?
That I totally agree with what you're saying. The house does win, but here's the thing: what about if, toying with that idea of the selection pressure, and the hierarchical organization itself is set up to select not from the top; it's actually to select from the bottom. So what I mean is, you have all of this pressure that is, being kinetically and sort of enforced or placed upon the bottom of the rung of the ladder, right? That itself, like what you were saying with, this sort of selection process, and there was that individual, I forget his name now, but he says, you can whittle it down out of 100. You might have 9 that effectively go through the eternal winter and realize within themselves as an invincible summer, and then there's one, just one, that can, just he carries the whole battle, right? He is this sort of demigod, and he becomes a demigod because of the selective pressures. Do you know it's very similar to a film called Ready or Not, and it just came to mind there, which is that effectively there you have this family called the Ludemas, right? The Ludemas family. I mean, the etymology of that name alone, the esoteric symbolism behind it is interesting nonetheless. Of course, le is the prefix of the article in French of the, um, and then of course domas or dumbass. It's a sort of joke because they're all stupid, but domas is it means the farmstead or of the farmstead or of the house, right? So the idea that they are the house, right? The house always wins, but in this case they don't. Um, and in this case, they realize that they're not the house, right? They're not of the house. They're not in the clique. But anyway, so it can also mean domas can mean to tame or to break in or taming itself. So they are tamed, interested, they're settled, they're not wild anymore, right? So this is all very interesting. And then Ready or Not itself, the idea is that you have a fictional ultra wealthy board game dynasty, wherein effectively they've made, hundreds of years ago, for fame and fortune and power and wealth and what have you, they made a bargain, a Mephistophelian bargain, a Faustian bargain with the devil. They call him Mr. Lubel, right? And the only way they can maintain the one sort of contractual stipulation of this bargain was that whenever anyone gets married to someone outside of the family, they have to play a little game, right? So they sort of do a wheel of fortune. And some of them are just really innocuous board games and such, right? And fun games like charades or what have you. And then what happens is the person that's marrying into the family just wins the game, and then that's it. But they've got one called hide and seek, and that's where effectively they have to hide, and the family seeks them out and effectively has to kill them, right? To slaughter them. And if they survive, then the family die, right? The Ludemas family die. So you have this idea, and basically what happens is at the beginning she is the bride to be. She's marrying into this family. She pulls the hide and seek card. She thinks it's just a little game, and then she, the dumbasses, the Ludemasses, they shoot the maid by accident, thinking, of course, it's the bride. And she sees this and she realizes, oh my God. And then what it shows is she goes through an alchemical transformation. and she eventually does it. She tries to escape the house. She realizes, there's no escape. She gets taken back by the butler. And then she goes all sort of Rambo-esque. The selective pressure kicks in, and the survival mechanism kicks in, and she just basically kills them all.
Hey,
And
we lost you. We lost you there for a little bit, for like 10
oh,
seconds.
all right, right. She tries to escape. Did you? It was at that bit. She tries to escape.
Yeah.
She realizes there's no escape effectively. So then that survival instinct kicks in, and she, effectively kills a load of the family. The family, right at the end, before the dawn breaks, tries to sacrifice her to save themselves. And of course, she overpowers them all, right? And they all die. And you see the fear on their face. They're like, oh, maybe it was all just a lie. Then maybe it wasn't real. The bargain wasn't real. When they all survive after the first couple of seconds after the dawn, and then they all just start exploding. And it's a sort of black comedy. But what? And then Lubel, you see him, the apparition of him, and he basically he gives a nod to the bride who has survived. So what it shows, in sort of long ass analogy here, is that perhaps the selective pressures aren't for the top, they're for the bottom. And that's the reason for the hierarchical organization. They're not selecting for the top. In the grander cycle of things, perhaps they're selecting from that one lucky winner, if you will, of the grand murder dome that is hierarchical civilization and its various epochs. It's selecting for that one person that will rise above it all. Um, just a thought that occurred to me.
Yeah. Well, here's another question. I guess maybe at a more base level too. What is it selecting for? I mean, we're
Yeah,
assuming it's selecting for hyperpredation, and I guess we can kind of go, at least in my terms of thinking now, obviously, but looking for other avenues as well. Is it just selecting for hyperpredation, or is it looking to see if there is, again, coming back to pity, coming back to Tolkien, is there it's looking for an anomaly in the predation process, which would be pity. So is it looking for pity so that even though we have this hierarchical, exponentially increasing concrescence of predation, examples of which, obviously capitalism is the best example of this. Read Nick Land, read all that stuff to really see that fleshed out. Um, and like Nick Land says, right, nothing human makes it out of the near future. So is what makes us human that ability to pause? So like the phenomenologists talk about this, right? And Husserl mentions this, that really what allows us our sort of abstract consciousness is that we're able to enter sort of like pause time, if you will, in the sense that you can abstract things and you can create distance, like I mentioned earlier in our talk today. You can create distance between events and occasions of things happening and the abstraction process. But that pausing is what allows for pity and mercy and a non-predatory disposition in whatever particular instance you happen to be in. So is it that the cosmos is an engine that seeks to weed that out and destroy that? Nothing human makes it out of the future. Is the cosmos an engine that is looking to see which individualized beings, Klippa, which egos will, despite the, that accelerative drive and that sort of like almost anxious hurrying about for destruction that we are all participating in more and more and more every day, that a being would be able to pause and show pity for pity's sake, not nothing in terms of like advantage in that predatory process, which we know nature drives. We've already discussed, and I think we've established nature is a driving mechanism towards predatory evolutionary processes. So is that what makes us human? Is the ability to do that? And then this question then is kind of like right along with it, a little bit of an expansion of it. Is this entire technological exponential increase, do we submit to it a la land? Nothing human makes it out of the future. Do we negate the technological increase in a Luddite sense, or in a sort of a Ted Kaczynskian sense of like, burn it all down and no tech, right? Or do we move alongside of tech, and tech, which allows will to power in greater expression in the world, technology is there as a sort of like a bell ringing, like just a smack on the head every time of, can you pause and show pity? Can you pause and show pity? Can you pause and show pity each time, right? So that we evolve with tech to understand the role of pity in the cosmos. Which one is it? Is it an anomaly that needs to be done away with because coldness be my god? Is tech need to be done away with because it's supposed to be a Buddhist nirvana? Or is the which I'm leaning more towards, the cosmos is an engine to put you in relation to the world, to allow the chance for pity, which is that anomaly in the equation, so to speak.
Yeah,
because
yeah.
that anomaly comes with consciousness. You see what I'm saying? I guess that's what I'm trying to say, is that, like, because Husserl and the phenomenologists saw that abstraction allows for pause in the flow. Otherwise, you would just devour, like I said, like a snake or a crocodile. But it allows for the pause, so that in the upswelling of abstraction through the intellect, the Geist, its primary objective is to produce the hyperpredator. It's to produce that sort of demiurgic hyperpredator, but it's saklas, it's blind. And it doesn't see that in the very production of abstraction itself, an anomaly will always come with that in the equation, which is it allows you to pause, which allows you to empathize, which allows you to show pity.
Yes, it's almost they're attempting to solve the imbalanced equation. They're attempting to find the perfect solution to it. Perhaps as well they're trying to find the anomaly, because the anomaly itself is actually what maintains all of it. You know,
Hmm.
the idea of coldness be my god, and the sort of hyper predatory near future of, say, land. You Like what we've discussed, the problems with that is you eventually reach a 0 point of maximal predation, right?
Hmm.
And thus you
Hmm.
actually get rid of the anomaly, which provides the fricative force, which in fact produces the prey or the sustenance, which feeds the predation. It feeds the predation and also stops the predation, right? I mean, prey are not necessarily of pity; they can't experience pity, but they're pitiful, you know.
Hmm.
So
Hmm. Yeah.
they're objects of pity, or of our pity at least. So, in a sense, it's um, I I think, yeah, if you understand that all of the cosmos itself is a sort of a how could you describe it? Like a debris field of the shattered equation, right? The remainder of a sum of an imbalanced equation, then ultimately, if it was if the universe itself was almost like an artificial parabiotic womb for the gods, right? Who are trapped as sort of fractal essences that have merged from the throes of that divine contraction previously, then they need the remainder. They need the anomaly. They're constantly trying to almost evoke the anomaly. The only way to evoke the anomaly is like what Adam states, through all of these grotesque images, you know, all of this sort of what was the other term that he mentions? Sort of violence of form, and things such as that. It's the only way to bring it about. You can't. you can't necessarily, you can't freeze the equation. You can't put the equation to zero, because then, of course, it's no longer equal, thus you're no longer in existence. So if existence is the product of negation, or the anomaly, you must have the anomaly. So you must produce the anomaly continually. However, if we assume that they're trying to break out of this, if they no longer want this sort of, constant this sort of thermodynamic economy that's going on here with the cosmos, they don't want the hyper-predation or all of that, or they're trying to simply, solve the equation, then the best way to solve the equation would be non-being, would be simply to take themselves off the game board, right? Not necessarily to non-participate, but to in fact destroy their entire hyper-real simulation, to destroy the Earth, to destroy everything, to destroy the vivarium. Because why would you need it? Why would you constantly require the coaxing and cajoling of this mass of civilization to produce these great conquerors, or to produce this anomaly, which sort of pushes, either can provide a neutral or negative polarity to that positivity of predation, which allows, of course, time to continue on, and of course space to continue on as well, the
Yeah.
inflationary universe. So the inflationary universe seems to, if we were to anthropomorphize what's going on here, it appears it's looking for something. It expands because it's searching for something. This is the idea of Eros, right?
Mhm.
Perhaps it's searching for the anomaly. It's searching for the maintaining of the imbalance. And this, funnily enough, just lastly, this sort of relates to the ibis bird of Thoth, which is that even the eagle's similar, right? It has great eyesight. Why? Because it's looking for small critters of sustenance. Similarly, the ibis will spend, days and days and days searching around swamps for little, I forget the sort of morsels of sustenance that it feeds on, but there's not many of them, and it searches very diligently and very patiently and non-stop for these morsels of sustenance. And in a similar way, that's what's going on here, perhaps. I would wager, you know. So
So that
yeah,
it would be like pity produces prey then, which is
pity
necessary for
produce.
the process.
Yeah, pity produces pay. Pay. Well, pay. Yeah, it produces pay, but it produces prey. Yeah, so it's which of course then sustains the predator. So
Hmm.
and then of course the predator itself, the people that go through the Negredo and become so horrified by the grotesque image of the reality, the truth of the universe, they go into a state of paralysis. Why? Because they become overly pitiful, because they
Mm.
pity the prey in which they have left, which is, of course, their peers, right? Um, their fellows, who did not, seek to soar as high as they did. Um, so those who transcend that, who transcend the sort of embryonic barrier of that world egg, who accept and embrace the truth of this world, no matter how grotesque it is, um, they themselves become one of the managerial elite, right? Because the gods would want to or the sort of these praetor-human super essences would want to have them on their side more so, because of course if they become competitors at that point, because they realize the metaphysics that's going on here, and they reject the duality. Well, they don't necessarily reject the duality, but they embrace the duality, and they understand the duality as an illusion, right? That can be utilized and manipulated so
Hmm.
that they themselves can become hyper predators. So ultimately, it's a feedback loop. The ones who don't make it through the Negredo and the great work, they simply produce the next stage of this pity, right? And
Hmm.
which creates the prey, which sustains the predator, so on and so forth, ad infinitum. I think that's what's going on here.
Yeah. I'll quickly here. I'll read a little excerpt from Chumley, Dragon Book of Essex, and we can see a lot of language here, and it's just replete with language when you go through the whole thing. But just a quick snippet here from the Rite of Thuban, and it says, "O Althuban, thou who dost stand above all at the pinnacle of the sky, here cast down thy harvest of fiery grain, gathered from the fields of eternity. For the primordial inferno is cast out from the void, and here doth burn within us, that star unto star, flesh unto flesh, we alone may bear forth thy flame through the darkness of creation. For we are thy flesh illuminate, O Azdeha. From Thuban's reign within the height, till 7 stars cast forth their light, both as one, the dragon's kin, shall turn and take the monarch's skin. O phoenix mask, hide thou our face, till thou hast claimed the highest place. Both as one, through solstice pyre, shall walk the blade and steal the fire. The turning blade shall cut the way for the sun's rebirth with each new day. Both as one, our deeds decree the pauper's rise to royalty. To brightest day from darkest night, through dawn and dusk to blackest light. All as one, our steps decree this turning maze of ecstasy. And then in the spiral dance, upon the back of thee, on earth neath Thuban and Helios, we have stepped and returned to the dance of the dragon, thus to exact the mystery through which the turning void didst create the stellar Naos for our cunning nature, and the cradle for the nurturing of our sorcerous flesh. In the spiral dance upon the back of thee, O Azdeha, we have refracted the step of equipoise through the angles of the double pyramidion. We have come forth through the arts of the sacred isle, through the division of blood midst the lineage of time, through the division of time midst the turning of the year, to stand here, ourselves enthroned within ourselves, as the living flesh of thy power." So there's just tons of language there, that's just in that short section, and you can see this sort of idea of, again, the dominance of this plasma entity or entities as represented or sourced from this the constellation of the dragon, particularly Thuban, which was the pole star right at the time of the building of the pyramids. And there's this general idea of essentially calling down this power into these people, these humans, these beings themselves, and then through that process they take on these masks, right? Masked by the phoenix. In other areas he speaks of millions of forms of being and wearing these different masks in this reincarnative cycle that they will go through this process of basically being reborn into a new form or new mask of being, but that centralized monarchical power being drawn.
Oh, lost you there, man.
Influence the earth. Can you hear me?
Oh, sorry, we lost you. They lost that, and then you went totally
Gotcha.
silent.
Yeah, no, yeah. A little bit something wrong with the connection maybe. But the point is though, is that it's the drawing down of this power from this entity, right? These higher order beings, drawing that power in to then have direct effect in the earth on a multi-generational level through bloodline. I mean, it's literally everything said in the short piece here, right? So it's all inculcated in there. And I like your idea of pity producing prey, which continues this constant wheel. I mean, it puts you in a rock and a hard place. You can predate and be part of one spoke of the wheel, or you can show pity and generate prey, which the predator feeds upon, and that turns this wheel. of the year, turns the wheel of the aeons. That's what he says by referring to the seven stars and the turning of wheels within wheels. You have the wheel of the day, the wheel of the month, the wheel of the year, and these years are within the wheels of the aeon, which are in the wheels of the procession, right?
And also as well, it mentions the pauper becomes the king or something, and the king's
Because that
skins.
is at that.
Oh, sorry,
I
continue.
lost you.
Sorry, we
No, no,
lost you a
you're
bit there.
yeah, we keep losing each other, it seems, and then like I can't hear anything, you can't hear me. So no, go ahead, go ahead.
Um, it, Sorry about that. It mentions the also as well. Well, of course, we have the seven stars, which relates to the 7 days. The seven aeons, the seven. Pardon me, the seven aeons, the seven archons, the seven apkallu, the saptarishi or the seven sages. You've all of these seven, right? And moreover as well, it mentions that the pauper will was it take the mantle of the king or the prince, and
Hmm.
within that too, it also mentions that the king will have his skin flayed, or something along those lines. So it's almost relating to the notion that the meek will inherit the earth. So
Hmm.
the meek inherits the earth, yes, because as we're stating here, the meek aren't a singular entity. You have the meek, which are subdivided into the total peons, just ignorant masses that have no idea of the thermodynamic economy that's going on here. And then you have the those who have went up to the threshold of Negredo, become horrified by it. They produce pity en masse. They pity their peers that they see in ignorance, and of course, this produces the prey, which so on the cycle goes. But also as well, and this is what we see with Adam and Eve. They're the similar sort of ignorant masses that begin the cycle. But you also have that, of course, that meek person, meek of material, but not meek of spirit and heart, who who sees Negredo and breaks right through it, and he does
Yep.
inherit the earth as the king. You know, the pauper shall become the king.
Like because like I mean, the Bible says God is no respecter of persons, right?
Yeah,
And what it means by that is he's not going to respect you because of some name or title that you have or that you have generated. He's looking for will to power. Again, special forces selection. It's just the perfect example. They don't care if you're the governor's son or if you're some farm boy from, you know, yeah, Ohio, right? If you got it, you just got it, right? If you got the fire, you just have the fire. And then you're going to push and drive things in that direction. And that's what they're looking for, right? They don't care like, oh, my dad has this much money, my dad's this person, blah, 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 blah. You come in there and you're crawling through the mud under the barbed wire and doing all this other crazy stuff to break you, going through the Negredo, Hell Week, right? For the Navy SEALs or what have you. You're going through hell for this process of dissolution, and everyone's going to quit and drop out and all this other stuff. And it's not, it's the process is automatic. It's not respecting your person. You don't have an advantage because of who you are as to like name and title or rank, right? The only advantage is the burning flame within you, right? And that's what the selection is looking for. So it doesn't matter if you're a Gates or you're a Rothschild or what have you. Now they're running along certain bloodlines which should produce fire is the idea, but if it's not there, they just immediately just they're going to get snuffed out, right? Because it's not respecting their person. So yeah, the pauper can become the monarch, right? Through this process, but it's a again, like everything else, it's a selection pressure.
yeah. Effectively, Yahweh is a marine drill sergeant. We've
Basically.
we've concluded it. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's like Full Metal Jacket here. But yeah, yeah. I agree. It's rather interesting when you look at it this way because what it's showing is ultimately metaphysically the creators of this vivarium, they're in search of something, right? And as we are potentially speculating here, they're in search of that anomaly because that anomaly maintains they're food for the moon, right? They're food for the gods,
Mm,
and
hmm.
so it maintains this cycle. It, it,
Yeah,
yeah,
that 28-day cycle of moon harvesting, 7 times 4 tetragrammaton, right?
yes, yeah, yeah, exactly, and all of these things are of course encoded in gematria as well. And it's the same ideas that you see within the mysteries too. And the there was something else that was mentioned there. Oh, spirals. It talks about spirals there within the Chumbly quote that you mentioned. So again, we're back to the Birkeland currents. There's also oh God, what was that? Just before you go, I know you're probably short on time. What was it? Coulamb. Kula, is it the Coulamb conicals or the Coulamb spirals, or I
Mm,
forget as well. There was something else I was gonna bring, and it skipped my mind. But it relates to the Birkeland currents, and interestingly, right now, this is a way that they're looking to create what they call neural dust, and
mm,
this neural dust is almost a very primitive way by which to establish dusty plasma, because they are electromagnetic, right? Or at least they can be they're paramagnetic, so they can be turned on at will, I believe. And so what they're seeing here with these neural dusts is that they can actually interact and almost ingrain themselves into organs, and
mm,
of course as well into one's mind. So you've got that, and you've got a couple of other technologies that they're attempting to unveil. But funnily enough, lo and behold, they're all surrounding the idea of plasma and
hmm. Yep.
electromagnetism, and basically toroidal technologies. So this thing isn't necessarily now science fiction anymore. It's not necessarily just born of utopian Renaissance or medieval thinkers or ancient utopian thinkers. This is something we're now living through the transitional uh, uh, sort of footsteps of. We are
Mhm.
experiencing it firsthand, So just to mention that too.
Yeah, yeah, and as I think as I've mentioned before, again, the if you especially if you look at the electric universe movement, and I think a lot of their stuff is really really good, and I use a lot of their stuff as sort of a cosmological basis to understand a lot of the things that I'm talking about. Where they point about how like the northern poles of celestial bodies are essentially like an intake valve for Birkeland currents or plasma currents, um, which are established through like scalar fields, and this allows for transfer of information, right? And a lot of this information can travel at light speed or perhaps even instantaneously. And if you combine that with like Rupert Sheldrake's understanding of morphogenetic fields, which I think is really accurate. The work of the scientist Michael Levin is really good to look into because this is going to, I think, open up a lot. I get a lot of so I combine like Rupert Sheldrake, Michael Levin, which just Michael Levin's just doing all the experiments proving Sheldrake's theories true. Um, but that really allows you to understand how the plasma body is formed, and because quickly Michael Levin is shows through his experimentation that it's not DNA that so much guides the like blueprints of the formation of an organism, but it's essentially the electrical field, the electromagnetic field, which dictates how and which aspects of the DNA sort of turn on. It's like the DNA is like the warehouse of materials, but how those materials are built and stacked and constructed, which building is made, is determined by the electrical field, which is Sheldrake's morphogenic genetic field, and which means that the planet's field is going to dictate what organisms can or cannot grow and produce, and how their nervous system and their minds will also be structured and function. So then you have to look into the nested positive like interactive relationships, so that if your immediate electrical field is determined by your lineage, which is then determined by your environment, And that environment is part of a larger environment of Earth. And that environment of Earth electromagnetically is influenced directly by the sun and the moon and the planets. What is the electromagnetic fields of the sun and the moon and the planets? What are they influenced by? Well, I just take a little geometrical aspect on this and say, well, all of their northern um, gateways to their celestial body, moon, sun, planets, are all in alignment with the constellation of Draco.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's any sort of electromagnetic connection to our solar system with that alignment, because it's all geometrical alignments, right? In astrology, it's about how these alignments are interacting with the sun and the earth and the moon, and that produces effects on the earth. I think the other day, yeah, in private conversation coming from the work of Dr. Farrell, I was talking about how the reason why they did so many nuclear tests when they first built the nuclear bomb is that they were getting all of these different yields of nukes. This one's supposed to be 5 megatons, but it turned up at 8. And then we did the same thing again, and it was 3 megatons. So what's going on? And they were reasoning. The idea is that it's because of the alignment of the planets, the sun, the moon, the stars. At different points, they were setting these things off. They would get different yields because what the nuclear bomb actually does is opens up a plasma gate. Because that's what it is. It's a plasma. Is that when they split these atoms and stuff like that, it opens up basically a gate into the ether, and it establishes a connection. And since all of these celestial bodies, due to their electromagnetic essentially density, they're all connected to each other. That once you sort of tap in artificially with a nuke, you tap into that electrical network. And so, depending on what's going on in the local field space, the lattice space, they call it, you could have different energy gating into that nuke you just sent off, which is basically like almost like a mini sun. This also comes from Tesla, Steinmetz, and a whole bunch of the other guys who were big on aether theory, right? And set up Maxwell, set up our whole electrical grid that we have today in terms of theory, at least, is that this understands the sun to be a gate. The sun is a gate, which is just what Plato and all the ancients said as well. But it's literally a gate, like physically a gate, because what it is that the interior of the sun is black, as you'll notice when we see a sunspot. It has a
Mm-hmm.
shell, a clippa of nuclear fission going on the outside, but on the interior it's black, and that's because what it essentially is, it's a node or a gate that's connected to the electrical circuit of the cosmos, and it's sharing power with these other um, with other celestial bodies, primarily stars. So I take all of this electrical information, because you do a lot of study in like Maxwell and all these other guys, and who's really good on this is Eric Dollard too. I think he's still alive, or he passed away recently. But Eric Dollard, and you can see him interviewed by various talk show hosts. He's kind of an eccentric guy, but he's the one who points this out. The sun is a gate. So depending on its alignment with its northern pole, it's gating in energy. And if it's gating in energy, it's gating in information. Then that sun is directly connected through an electrical line to the earth. So then I make the connection between Draco or the pole star, right? But particularly the Cat's Eye Nebula, which is what all the planets are aligned to, sun and moon, right? Except for the Earth, primarily, which because of its tilt rotates through the 7 pole stars. So you have a pole star influence, but then you also have like the central influence from the sun, as it's essentially locked onto that nebula at the heart of the Draco constellation. So I see that in a very literal way, non-metaphorically, influencing the aeons, or what we have here on Earth, go down that nested hierarchy of causative influential relations, and you get from Draco, from Polestar, through the sun to the Earth, direct influences upon the um, morphogenic fields of Sheldrake, or the electrical fields of Michael Levin, right? Which then directly influences how we think, how we act, how we grow, right? And all of those interactions, not only of us as humans, but the planet as a biosystem as a whole. So then what we actually have is this is how these higher order beings are influencing the world, right? Is through these essentially these electrical systems, because they are electrical beings themselves, these plasma beings or stars. Same thing. A star is a giant ball of plasma connected into this electrical grid of the universe.
Yeah, so it's effectively the nested reality in which we inhabit, which is produced through all of this sort of compartmentalized electromagnetism and all of the relationships and the network thereof. I mean, yeah, see a lot of this. The problem I have when we relay this to people is that, of course, they have preconceived notions that's been born out of conspiracy theories. I use that term quite literally because a lot of them are produced by the intelligence agencies, um, where it's almost obfuscating. It gives them the sensation that they're learning esoteric wisdom, but it's obfuscating all of this, how reality actually functions. So um, it's hard to get through to some people. It's hard for them to even entertain ideas because they have the idea of nuclear weapons, atomic fission, whatever it may be. That is fake. Space is fake. It's all fake. It's so it's
Yeah, even the physics. Well,
mm,
even the physics
yeah.
paradigms. I think
Yeah.
the Etherean view of like the Maxwellian electric universe grid, everything relate, because even in philosophy, right? Kind of started talking about relation,
Mm,
Whitehead. Everything's related. How does it relate physically? Through electromagnetism,
yeah.
right? So there is an actual physical relation. There's a psychological relation. You realize when you do your philosophy right and you contemplate, wow, I'm actually related to everything else. Everything is related to me as my individual ego person. I relate to
Hmm.
everything. There's a physical reflection of that. And like, yeah, you actually are electromagnetically connected to
Yeah.
everything because they correspond. And so they bring up physics paradigms like Einsteinian physics and quantum physics and stuff to hide and mask this. And people would say like, okay, yeah, well, they did that so they could produce all the technology. Yes,
Hmm.
but from my personal perspective, I think it was to hide the influence of the celestial bodies, which is where the
Yeah.
main power is coming from.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because
Which is, of
if you
course,
don't have this Etherean idea of like this electromagnetic connection, then you could not see like, well, what are you talking about? The stars in Draco or the moon? How is this affecting us? Because there's no physics there, right? So because there's no way to understand that physically. Now the ancients understood it without the physical paradigms, right? Because they might have had more direct experience of it. But when they bring in all these obfuscating paradigms, it hides it, and they say, "There's no possible way our sun is affected by the stars of Draco," and they don't see that because there's no physical paradigm to explain it. Well, I mean, there is. It's just been hidden and put away. You there?
yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I was actually muted there. Yeah, they've certainly done a number on us. Yeah, there's a grand chain of being, and I absolutely like what you're saying. People can debate, what we call this thing, but ultimately you can't get away from the fact that there is this chain of being. So it's sort of hard coded, it's encoded into the reality in which we abide within. We experience it and interpolate it, subconsciously, consciously throughout our, all of our days, right? And interestingly, I just wanted to sort of finish this off with one uh, one quote. Well, actually, two quotes, but they're very short, so don't worry. Um, and it's from, if I can find it, it's from where is it? Um, Here we go. Jack Lacan. And he stated, the unconscious is structured like a language. Man speaks then, but it is because the symbol has made him man. Man's desire is the desire of the other. It is not the subject who speaks, but language which speaks through the subject. We are spoken by the symbolic order. So we almost experience all of this relational chain of being in a purely subconscious, on a purely subconscious level. It's actually sort of akin to perhaps Jung's collective unconscious. So all of this is sort of an outpouring from us because, again, Homo est after nor Dei, man is the furnace of God. So man is the alchemical vessel by which all of this transmutation, this transition is occurring. We are the sort of Bifrost bridge between Midgard,
Hmm.
between the heavens and the earth, Midgard and Asgard, and like Odin, Odin is searching for, the Einherjar
Yep.
because
Yep.
he
I
himself
was going to
was.
bring that up. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, you were mentioning it with Yahweh, and I'm like, oh damn, I could mention that. I better not
Yeah.
because we'll go on another
Yeah.
tangent. But he's
Yeah.
searching for the Einherjar because he himself is doing battle with entropy. So
Right.
you're
Right.
seeing it written in here. He's trying to fight his own fate, similar to what we see, because all of the world is like Mercury. It appears to be this writhing motion, but ultimately it is totally stationary. It's just the glistening of the light and theater show that's occurring on the surface. So yeah, man, I don't know if you have any closing remarks, and we'll end it here. I think this has been good discussion.
No, yeah, great, great discussion. Always in process. So always throwing things around and trying to look at things at different angles, and always open to hear anyone's perspective. If anybody out there listening to this, if you think you have some insights, please, maybe come on the forum, jump on in, and throw them out our way. And I love to consider these things, even debate over some of these things, and say, well, what about this? What about that? How do we see this? How do we see that? So you can sort of like work our way through understanding a lot of these things. But I really do believe that this central idea of this general vector and drive through history towards predation is pretty solid. I think we just pretty much see that everywhere you go based on the Heraclitean flux. It then just comes down to these anomalies, that arise from the ability of our minds to abstract, that Geist, that infection of language, right? To bring that in, that allows for this whole sort of like rhizomatic network of possibilities. It lifts us up sort of a level where we don't have to be a pure devourment, and it becomes we become a fusion of perhaps what we would say as like the Empyrean or the celestial and the earthly, sort of like this verticalized way of like observing the world, but then also we are always engaging with the world. You got to eat, you got to go, use the restroom, you have to go get some water. So we're sort of a combination. I think we sort of see this, not to go on too much of a tangent, but just to close this here with, this the figure of Zervan, right, out of the Persians, the god, where you have it's the combination of man, serpent, and lion, right, as he sits in the celestial clockwork of the procession of the equinoxes. He's at the center of it, which is Draco. And Draco is known as the dragon, right? But I see it often as the lion headed. And what you have is it's the lion serpent sun. You have a fusion of the lion, which is the mammal, and the serpent, which is the reptile, and sort of like this fusion of man with this reptilian drive of devourment, and it creates like a lion, right? And so you have this lion-headed serpent, the demiurge, right? Yaldabaoth, which is this Draco constellation or representation of this. And so we are caught, like you say very well, betwixt the celestial and the earth, the devourment and the abstract consideration of our devourment. We don't blindly devour. We can consider how we devour. And so that puts us in a real unique position. And I'm very fascinated with always considering this prospect and navigating through life as we, on this vector of time, we awake every day. in this process, and what it means to be a player in this game, to be halfway between lion and serpent, and how do we balance that. So if anybody ever wants to participate, I'd always love to hear it. But yeah, great chat.
Well, with that, man, thank you very much, and I appreciate you joining me today. And to all the audience members as well, thanks for listening thus far. This is going to be a long discussion. I've just checked the time there, but yeah, there's much more to discuss on this. I also as well have a ton of other discussions to upload from me and Eros. I've actually still to upload the Majora's Mask one as well. I'll need to get round to that today,
Yeah, well, we got to get
sometime.
to that one. I forgot. Yeah. Jeez.
Yeah. No, we did it. We recorded it in two parts, I'm pretty sure, but I just haven't uploaded it, unfortunately. I'm sure
Gotcha.
there's much more we can say on that as well. That was an interesting one. It was something I was pondering when I was working on Thursday. Yeah, just that idea. It's an interesting game. But anyway, man, yeah, thank you very much, and yeah, bye bye.
Yeah. Take care, everyone.